So my name is Shanice Hatfield, and I'm Region 5 Lead Trainer. On behalf of Region 5, Western Tidewater Community Services Board, I would like to thank you for attending the LGBTQ Clients Part 1, Queer Affirmative Strategies to Address Sexual and Gender Identity, presented by Testard. Few housekeeping rules to keep in mind. I will be monitoring the chat, and this training is recorded, and we will have about a 30-minute break in between. Aaron will go ahead and give us that time. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Aaron. If y'all have any questions specifically about the training, please direct them to me. I know Aaron will go over it in a second, but I know the way that we're doing the questions are a little different, so he'll go over that in a second. All right, Aaron.
Okay, thank you, Shanice. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I am so impressed, and I'm feeling so grateful that so many people have chosen to be here on a Friday to learn about this community, which is also my community. So I'm going to start my screen share, if that's okay, so we can all start to just see the PowerPoint here. All right. So this is our training today, LGBTQ plus clients, queer affirmative strategies to address sexual and gender identity. And to start, I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself so you know who I am, which will lead into an overview of this training and what to expect. So my name is Aaron Testard. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I identify as a gay or queer cisgender man. And if you, and some of you don't know what some of what I said means, you will in just a little bit. So my work with this community started around the time of my own coming out process in the mid-90s. That was a time when HIV was still a really big thing. We were just starting to come out with the antiretroviral meds for HIV. And so testing was a big thing. And I started volunteering as an HIV test counselor. I later started graduate school and started volunteering during graduate school as a group facilitator, a support group facilitator for HIV positive men in San Francisco. Later on, I got an internship at a place called the Pacific Center for Human Growth in Berkeley, California, which is the third largest LGBT center in the country, and it's a support and counseling center. So during that time, which was 2 years, I was able to learn a lot about the community. I worked with teenagers up to geriatric clients. I worked with groups, couples, and individuals, and got a lot of experience and got primarily psychodynamically trained. After my 2 years there, I went on to other things. I went on to be a substance abuse counselor at a program for men who have sex with men, or generally gay and bisexual men. And was there for almost 4 years. I also worked as a high school counselor and as a felon reentry specialist. And in the latter two positions, my superiors knew that I was LGBTQ myself and that I had worked at the Pacific Center. So I started getting assigned a lot of the LGBTQ clients, so was able to build more experience that way. I was later hired back at the Pacific Center on staff as the HIV program manager, and then was promoted over the years. I was promoted to the clinic manager and then to the program director position. And in that position, I oversaw the clinic as well as the community support groups and the community youth program. And I, supervised the interns and did a lot of community trainings and was there in that position for 7 years, and then went on to do my own full-time practice. And I now, work full-time as a consultant focusing on sexual and gender identity. And I work with ages 13 and up with individuals and couples and consult around the country. And now my practice is in Chicago as well as the Bay Area, because I moved to Chicago during COVID. So I practice in both areas. And my clients really vary. I have a lot of diversity in my practice. My clients are people who can barely afford to make ends meet in the Bay Area and are on Medicaid. And I also have clients who are in higher level socioeconomic positions. And I'm getting into all of this, and I think I part of my introduction is to tell you a little bit about me, but a part of it is also to really emphasize what a broad community this is, what a diverse community this is. There is so much that we could address in this training. And we could spend a day on one segment of this population. For example, substance abuse among gay men, trans children, lesbian sexuality, BDSM, you name it. And so my job is to, and how I see this training being the most effective, is to help give you a sort of working map, like a GPS system, to help you kind of zoom out and give you a sense of how to move towards certain choices in your work with any LGBTQ client you work with, no matter who they are. So as we go along and questions come up for you, a lot of where you may start to feel stuck can be directed back to the map that I'm going to provide for you. So I hope that that's helpful. And this is just something, a little something I say at the beginning, any information that I give to you may fall outside of your scope of practice or competence. That's just up to you to determine. And I always address conflicts of interest. I have no financial conflicts of interest. No one is paying me to endorse any particular modality or anything like that. And I have certain non-financial relationships that I think it's important to disclose. I'm a member of WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. That's a very important organization that really oversees healthcare policy for trans people around the world. And I will be mentioning them later because they've had a lot of influence around how we work with transgender clients. I'm also a member of an organization called Gay Lesta, which is a networking organization for LGBTQ therapists in the Bay Area. And I'm a participant in an organization called Mind the Gap, which is a group for therapists who work with trans children. And I'm a member of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapists and Queer and Trans Advocacy Network. And the reason I mention all of these is because all of them do some level of social and political advocacy. And I'll mention later on that when you work with the LGBTQ community, it's actually very hard to not be political in some degree, to not show up as a kind of a political presence. And I will talk more about that certainly later, how you can combine the political and the clinical in your work. It's very important with this community. Here's an overview of the seminar and what to expect. So this is a two-part seminar. Today, we're going to be focusing on the first 3 bullet points listed here. I'm going to go to my laser pointer. There we go. So the first 3 bullet points, I'm going to talk about the history of LGBTQ community and treatment. And when I introduce that, I will really clarify why it's important for us as clinicians and providers to understand LGBTQ history to some degree, not necessarily real deeply, but to some degree. Next, we'll talk about the current understandings, frameworks, and challenges with this community. So I'm going to talk about the historical trajectory leading up to now, and we'll talk about the current context so we can understand what we're working with. Next, I will talk about how to establish safety and trust with LGBTQ clients. So that's foundational as providers. And I often say that if you can do this effectively, if you can establish safety and trust with queer clients in your practice, you're well more than halfway there to doing good work with them, just creating that safe space. Next Friday is going to be part 2. So that's what I call is it'll be more kind of sophisticated. So we're going to really amp things up and get deeper into the work. So next week, we'll get into talking about clinical considerations and assessments, how to assess, how to conceptualize treatment for LGBTQ people. I particularly focus on LGBTQ related trauma because the trauma of being LGBTQ is a very, very important part of treatment. And then we'll talk about the LGBTQ identity development map, which will include these phases of development, 6 phases of identity development that pretty much all LGBTQ people go through. And then we will talk about how to identify each phase with your clients so that you can apply the appropriate strategies with them. Okay, so that's coming next week. But for today, we're going to focus on these first 3 bullet points. So at this point, I just want to just get to know my audience a little bit, because everyone who comes to my trainings has there's a variety of experience. Some people have no experience with this population. Some people have a lot of experience, and so I just want to get a sense of like where you feel you fall kind of on that spectrum. Where you're at is where you're at. There's no right or wrong answer here. There should be a hand raise section. And what I'm gonna do now is just kind of go to the list of people who are here and just get a sense of who's raising their hand. I'm more interested in the number of hands right now than the specific individuals. So I'm going to invite you, if you could, to go to the hand raise section and raise your hand if the first bullet point applies to you. If you have no to little experience or exposure with this population, meaning you don't really know much about LGBTQ people at all, you don't really know many people. Anyone who falls into that category? Okay, we have a few people. A few people still raising their hands here. They're sending me a clap. Okay. 4 or 5. Okay, so a small portion. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go to the next bullet point. Please raise your hand if you have social exposure to this population. So you do have friends and family who are LGBTQ, but you have little experience as a provider. Okay, a few more of you now. So, okay, a lot of you who do have some exposure to this. Yeah. A lot more people. Thank you. That gives me a good sense. All right. All right, so we can put the hands down there. All right, next, please raise your hand if, this is a common one, if you feel you have more experience and competency working with sexual orientation as a provider, like you feel like you have a lot of experience working with the gay, lesbian, bisexual community, but less experience and competency with gender identity with the trans community. Okay, a few of you. Okay, thank you. Good. It's about 8 people raised their hands there. And please raise your hand if you have worked with this population clinically as a provider. You feel like you know this population well as a provider clinically, and you would just like to broaden and strengthen your knowledge. So you feel like you have worked with this population clinically, but you feel like you do have some basic knowledge, but want to build on that. How many of you? Oh, quite a few of you. Okay. Quite a few of you feel like you have some basic experience, about 21. Thank you. All right. And then I'm going to go to the final question. See if we can put the hands down here. Okay. I'm going to go to the final question. Raise your hand if you've worked with this population for a while. You know it well clinically. You feel like you really know this population well, but you're really looking to deepen your knowledge to get deeper with this. And raise your hand. Okay. Just maybe just a few of you. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, that helps me a lot. All right. So we're going to dive in. Before we do, I will tell you how I'm going to do questions. So because I have so much material, I want to make sure I get to it all. I actually have sections where I stop and I answer questions. So I tend to not, at least in this format, on the online format, I tend not to answer questions as I go along because I want to make sure I provide you with all the material. So I will have sections where I stop and I answer questions. So I'm going to invite you, as a question comes up in each section for you, either put it in the chat or let Shanice know. And so when we break for questions, I will stop and I will look in the chat, or I will ask Shanice if there are any questions to answer. So we will take kind of question breaks. So after I go over the history section, I will stop and I will check in about who has questions about the historical overview and so on and so forth. My hope is also that we'll leave enough time at the end, 15 minutes or more, to answer questions, to have something more interactive where we can kind of unmute you and you can ask me questions more directly at the end. I would love to offer time for that. And I plan to, we have a half-hour break, I understand. So I plan to take that break at about 10:45. So I'm gonna work on, tracking that. Okay, so we're gonna get started here. And we're gonna get started with history, in a section with what I call how we got to now. How did we get to where we are today? Things have happened actually things have changed very quickly in the last 20 years. People often say that to me. And so sometimes there's confusion about how did we get to that point, to conceptualizing and framing the LGBTQ community as we know and understand it today. And there are three reasons that I often say it's important to understand, for us as providers to understand LGBTQ history. First, it does provide context for understanding where we are at today. So that's the first reason. Secondly, it helps us to connect with people who lived through the history. So as I go into the history and I get into certain parts, 50s, 60s, and 70s, that is a time when our clients that we have now may have lived through, and our clients have been impacted by those historical situations. So if we know what our clients of different ages went through, that is a part of connecting with them and building safety and rapport. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that historical education can be a part of our clinical work with clients, educating clients about history, and also it can help resource the clients. I'll say a lot more about internal resourcing later on and how important that is for working with this community, but knowing about history, especially historical figures, can be an important part of resourcing and educating clients. So when we look at societies throughout history and even today, we can see that societies have different ways of responding to sexual and gender variation. Now, when we talk about the LGBTQ community, we are talking about sexual and gender variation. That means the people in this community, our clients, our queer clients, their experience of sexuality and gender does not align with the dominant cultural narrative. So in societies throughout history and today, different societies have responded differently to sexual and gender variation. And usually it's in one of three ways. One, it's punished, right? Two, it's tolerated, right? So it's not exactly punished, it's not accepted, but somewhere in the middle. And three, it is accepted. So we can see different parts of the world, different communities where one of those dynamics is going on. So I would like to start with you around the cultural narrative of acceptance historically and what that has looked like, because it really comes down to cultural and societal narratives about sex and gender. And when we look at history and even societies today that still exist today, there are societies around the world that have experienced some level of there are some, I should say, LGBTQ cultures, sexual and gender variant cultures that have experienced some level of acceptance by the dominant society. So we can look at, for example, the Hijra of South Asia, the Mahu of the South Pacific, Muhe of Mexico, the Katoi of Thailand. But particularly for our purposes, I'm going to focus on the Two-Spirit people of North America, just to kind of illustrate how this works. Now, before I talk about Two-Spirit people, I just want to acknowledge there may be some of you in the audience who identify as Two-Spirit, or some of you may know or work with people who identify as Two-Spirit. It is part of the larger LGBT community today. It is often included in the LGBTQ acronym. Two-spirit people are basically LGBTQ people who are of indigenous descent, of American indigenous descent. And Two-Spirit was an umbrella term that was established in the 1990s for the sake of unity among queer indigenous people. And it was really to honor the idea of sexually and gender variant people in indigenous tribes having a place in their societies over time. So Two-Spirit is a relatively recent umbrella term used by indigenous people, not to be appropriated, I should add. But historically, when we take a closer look at indigenous nations, we can see that each community had its own way of identifying and interacting with people who were queer, who were sexually and gender variant. So, and each particular tribe, community, or nation had its own kind of way of naming people and finding a place for them in society. But for the most part, what we see in the documentation is that there was not just a place for these people in society, there was a place of honor, value, and purpose. So people who were sexually and gender variant actually had a place that, offered, a sense of value to the community. Roles such as social worker, medicine person, priest. These were high-level positions, in which the people were interacting with the community and were seen as holding a certain level of wisdom because they had the masculine and the feminine, that they held the masculine and feminine energy within them, thus the term Two-Spirit. And they were seen as, because they had both masculine and feminine features, traits, spirit, energy, that they had something special to offer society. So this is a cultural narrative of acceptance that lasted for centuries among these communities. So by contrast, I'm going to bring in a different cultural narrative, which is one of punishment, and which came from Europe, from European colonization. So as we all know, in 1492, the Western settlers came to the Americas and really pushed their cultural narratives, views, and values onto the indigenous tribes and wiped out much of that culture. And part of that imposing of their narrative was their imposing of their model of sexuality and gender. And this model is what the legal scholars have come to call the natural law model. So the natural law model is very, pretty simple. It says, if you are born with a certain set of sex characteristics, that you are assigned to a gender role for life, and that sex is to be between people of different genders for the purpose of procreation. That is the natural law model, and it was the dominant cultural narrative for centuries in Europe, and then for several centuries in the Americas. So this was a model of punishment. So the manifestations of that were variation malignans. Anything that varied from that was seen as being bad for society. Very opposite from what how the indigenous communities held it, right? There was sanctioned social ostracism. So it was actually encouraged for people to be ostracized from their communities. And also any behavior that was outside of the natural law model was criminalized. You could be punished for it, put in jail, put to death. So this natural law model came from Europe and really influenced every aspect of society. So it influenced the church, it influenced the law. And by the way, there was something else I wanted to say about that, but it'll come back to me. But it influenced the church, it influenced the law, it influenced education, but particularly for our purposes and what we're learning here, it influenced the field of science and medicine. So when we talk about medicine, we also start to get into the field of sexology. And sexology, as we know it today, is a very sex positive field. But sexology actually started out as being rooted in the pathology of sexuality, of anything that was outside of sex for procreation. Okay, so whenever sex was not had for the purpose of procreation, it fell outside of this model and started to be seen as pathological, not just a sin, but medically pathological. Oh, and by the way, what I was going to say was the reason for the natural law model. We could spend all day on, why this was and has been, but a lot of it had to do with religion, of course, the force of religion during that time, and also the necessity of agrarian society. So we'll see when things started changing during the Industrial Revolution. So, but this model still was a part of our society for a long time. So in this context, we start to see the development of the terms heterosexual and homosexual. And these terms are first developed by a man named Dr. James Kiernan, who was essentially from medicine and started in this early field of sexology. And he developed the terms heterosexual and homosexual to mean any sex that was outside of procreation. So heterosexual meant that, two people of different sexes or genders were having sex not for the purpose of procreation. So heterosexual was even a pathological term, according to him. And then homosexual meant two people of the same sex were having sex not for the purpose of procreation. Okay, so those were the initial meanings of those terms. Later the same year, Dr. Kraft Ebing and defined the terms heterosexual and homosexual in the ways we understand them today. So it was him that really brought into the fold and normalized the idea that heterosexual was normal. When two people of different sexes or genders have sex, even if it's not for procreation, that's normal sexuality. But homosexual, two people of the same sex or gender having sex, was abnormal. And because of this had so much influence, this started to become part of the dominant cultural narrative. And by the way, a lot of younger people don't really like the term homosexual anymore because it is rooted in the pathology of same-sex attraction. This was the beginning of sex and gender medicalization, of saying that, homosexuality was sick, it was an illness. And so medical treatment started to be performed on people who were supposedly or suspected homosexuals. So medical treatment at that time could look like hypnosis, castration, but later on it could look like lobotomies or electroshock therapy. And by the way, when I talk about homosexuality in these early days, it also includes anyone who was sexual and gender variant. So people who we would identify today as transgender would be folded into the homosexual category at this time. Anything outside of that dominant cultural narrative was considered homosexual. So the field of medicine, as I'm going somewhere with this, the field of medicine influenced psychoanalysis. So when it came to psychoanalysis, there was a split. There were opposing views on homosexuality. Now, Sigmund Freud actually did not see homosexuality as an illness. And there's a lot of documentation to prove this. Freud's belief, and this was pure theory, but his belief was that we are all innately bisexual. And that whether you're heterosexual or homosexual, that's conditioned in childhood. But he believed that once it's rooted, once you set that programming, it can't be changed. So he would often tell parents, don't bother to try to change your homosexual son or whatever. And so that was his position on it. But his student and contemporary named Willem Steckel believed something different. And it was Willem Steckel who really spearheaded this notion that you could cure homosexuality through psychotherapy. Again, it was pure theory. There was no research or evidence based on this, but he wrote extensively about it. So he also believed that we're all bisexual and that homosexuality or heterosexuality is conditioned in early childhood, but he believed that you could change it, that the therapist could go in and cure the homosexuality and make someone heterosexual. And he wrote a whole book about it, The Homosexual Neurosis. And this was really the foundation for the psychoanalysts, the psychotherapists who came along after him, who just kind of went with this notion that you could change homosexuality. So while this is happening, this is all becoming part of the dominant cultural narrative. It bleeds into the whole culture. And so now the whole community believes that homosexuality is not just a sin and immoral and illegal, it's now pathological. It is a sickness. So during this time, while this is the dominant cultural narrative, there's also a sort of activism happening underground, kind of pushing up against this dominant cultural narrative. And I'm going to talk a lot about this because this has a lot to do with where we are today. Where we are today has more to do with activism than it has to do with us changing, than therapists and providers changing. It has to do with the activists who pushed up against the narrative and said, no, this does not match what we are. We are not sick, right? We are not a sin. We are not dirty, right? So even in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, while this dominant cultural narrative was happening, there were people getting together underground, challenging it. And sometimes it was in secret, but they were challenging it. And that happened a lot in what was called underground urban balls. So that was when people who we would now identify as LGBTQ or queer, they would get together and they would have parties and they would celebrate who they are. And this is an illustration of that. But these urban balls have continued through time, and they're particularly in cities, particularly in communities of color, in the African-American community, in the Latinx community. Some of you may have heard of the ballroom scene. The ballroom scene, is portrayed in movies like Paris is Burning. You can hear a lot about it if you live in the city, especially. That's an extension of these early underground urban balls, right? And that is a sort of activism, changing the narrative. And you're going to hear me more about changing the narrative. So jump to around the 1920s. There was a shift in what sexology could be. I said earlier that with the field of medicine came sexology. Sexology was rooted in the pathology of anything that was non-procreative. That shifted in the 1920s with a man named Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld's a very important name in the LGBTQ community and the history books, because he really came to normalize and celebrate human sexuality in all of what it offered us. He argued that human sexuality was not just for procreation, but that it's an important means of self-expression and connection. And Magnus Hirschfeld he lived in Germany. He was from Berlin. He was a doctor. He was Jewish, and he was also self-declared homosexual, which at that time was really radical. But he was an out homosexual, and he was the one who said there's nothing wrong with this. And not only was he a part of those urban balls early on, but he actually created an institute for sexual science to actually start to study human sexuality in a different way, in a way that said this is part of being an authentic, full human being. And so it was Magnus Hirschfeld who started things like sex and gender research, right? It's not just theory, we're going to do research. sex education, medical assistance for sex and gender minorities, safe shelter for sexual and gender minorities. So he became very well known throughout Europe and the Americas, and people would come to visit him. And so here's a picture of him in 1920. I'm circling his head with the laser here, and with a lot of his friends and colleagues who, were homosexual, transgender, queer at that time. And this is where I'll say you can use history to educate and to resource clients. Some older clients and educated clients may know who Magnus Hirschfeld is, but we can also educate on Magnus Hirschfeld, because one thing our clients struggle with is visibility and the shame that comes with that, and the minority stress. So one thing that can help with that is offering examples of people who had to face that and overcame that. And Magnus Hirschfeld is a great example. Being openly homosexual at this time and creating this research center, he did it against all odds. So also in the 1920s, something important that was happening, and it's very important even to recognize still today that this is an important dynamic: social exposure to gay nightlife, which is another way of saying social exposure to queer people. I think most of us intuitively know that what changes people's hearts and minds is not, sometimes it can be education, but much more so than education, it's exposure. It's social exposure, getting to know people who are different. And at this time in the 1920s, this was happening for the first time, where gay people and straight people were mixing it up in the nightclubs. And this was happening in a couple of ways. One way was in America, we had the prohibition laws. So these underground nightclubs started to happen, especially in the cities, notably in Harlem, in New York. People would get together, and it was people of different races and also people of different sexualities. And people were just having a good time. It didn't matter, what the race or the class or the sexuality of the other person was. People were just enjoying each other's company. That was the first time this was happening. So it's like something that came out of the Prohibition era. And also in Germany, in Berlin, there actually were liberal laws pre-World War II, before the Nazis took over. Very different picture when the Nazis took over, but during the Weimar Republic, Germany had very liberal laws, and there were these nightclubs where there would be drag performances, people would be openly out, and straight people would come to those clubs as well. If you've ever seen the musical Cabaret, that's a depiction of that kind of nightlife. So a very important part of the history. Now, after the 1920s came the 30s, then that's when the Nazis started to take over in Europe. There was World War II. And then after World War II, there was a swing back to the natural law model, a swing back to the way things were, because people wanted to get back to normal. The war had taken years. And so people just wanted to get back to that. So there was a real conservative swing back. And so what we see in the 1950s is, back to this prevailing discourse that homosexuality is a disease, it's a sin, it's a crime, all of those things. And there are regular raids on homosexual gatherings. So if there was gay people getting together, even at someone's home or at a bar, the police would have their radar up for it, and they would raid these parties. And not just would they raid the parties, they would take the people to jail and publish their names in the newspaper. So they would be publicly shamed, and homosexuals would not be able to get a job. And also US government employees were fired. They needed to be fired. A lot of people know about the Red Scare in the 1950s, where people went after communists. What was also happening at this time was something called the Lavender Scare, where people who were suspected homosexuals were targeted. They were government employees, they were targeted and fired for being even suspected homosexuals at this time. So this was all a part of, this was normal at this time, what was happening. And also, the DSM had recently been established, and homosexuality was a disease, right? Was a disorder in the DSM. So this was the prevailing discourse, but I must say that there are challenges. There were challenges happening to this discourse. There was that activism. There were people saying, no, what's happening is not right. And these were notably underground groups, such as the Mattachine Society, which was a group of gay men in Los Angeles who worked underground and, worked to, activate some sense of community around the country. They got a mailing list, they sent out brochures, magazines, and they mobilized. Harry Hay, who is the leader of the Mattachine Society, another notable name who could be used as a resource, right? Who was against all odds, did this. There was also the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco, same thing, a group of lesbian women in the 1950s who were also mobilizing around the country. And also on a clinical level, there were clinicians, therapists, providers who were going against the fold. A lot of us know about Alfred Kinsey's research, who, he came up with the sexuality spectrum. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. But Alfred Kinsey's research, he was way ahead of its time. It really didn't get real cultural notoriety until about the 70s. But boy, it was radical, when he did studies on men and found that most men had some sexual desire or behavior or fantasy towards the same sex or gender. So the idea of sexuality being a binary, he was arguing in his research, was actually constructed, in our culture. And in reality, sexuality is on a spectrum. That was radical. And then there was Evelyn Hooker's research. That was really key in the 1950s. I will say a little bit about her research because it was so pivotal in changing things for homosexual people. This was 1957. Evelyn Hooker was a psychologist herself, and she noticed that the literature about homosexuality, the literature pathologizing homosexuality and saying that homosexuals, were mentally ill, was primarily referencing homosexuals who were institutionalized. And it was also focused on men as well, but it was focused on these homosexual men who were institutionalized and using them as examples for why homosexuality was a disease. And Evelyn Hooker's, her position was that's not really fair. You have to have two equal groups. And so she got money to do this study where she surveyed two different groups, one of heterosexual men and one of homosexual men. And she made sure that they came from the same educational background, the same socioeconomic background. That was really important for her. And what she found when she studied it that way, there was no difference in functioning. There was no difference in psychological or behavioral functioning between homosexual and heterosexual men. That study was done in 1957. It was key to getting the homosexual disorder removed from the DSM in the 1970s. But a lot is to be thanked for her research. So I have a slide here on the published clinical differences on sexual and gender variation, just to kind of let you know the tension that was happening between the late 40s and the early 60s among clinicians and researchers. You've got Alfred Kinsey's research, which I mentioned already, but then you've got David Caldwell, he wrote the first book about transgenderism, or at the time it was called transsexuality. He wrote the first book about it, but it was focused on the pathology of transsexuality. You got Donald Webster, who was a sociologist, who actually wrote a book under a pseudonym about his experience as a homosexual in America. So it was a kind of an anecdotal example of what it's like to be a homosexual, and it was sold in mainstream bookstores. Then you've got these two guys, Edmund Bergler and Irving Bieber, who were really pushing for the idea that you could change homosexuality. It was actually a pretty popular notion at the time. And then you've got Evelyn Hooker pushing up against this. So during this time, you've got this tension between this dominant cultural narrative and then these clinicians who were really kind of activist clinicians pushing up against it. So by the 1960s, the prevailing discourse is the same. Homosexuality is still considered a disease, a sin, and a crime. This is pervasive throughout society. Most people believe this. There are still regular raids on homosexual gatherings. US employees are still being fired, but the challenges to that discourse intensify. So we start to see more visible activism. The 1960s, of course, was very influenced by the civil rights movement. Protests were very much in the zeitgeist. And so that really influenced people who identified as homosexuals at the time. So that was the term that was used. And so homosexuals, it started with homosexuals who had been fired from the government. And they would start to picket in Washington, D.C. And that's the picture that's posted here. And right here in front is a man named Frank Kameny, who was a chemist for the US government, who was fired for being homosexual. And he became a real leader in this movement. Again, very, very courageous what these folks are doing. And you can see a clip of this on YouTube. That's actually a very small group of people picketing with signs saying that they are openly homosexual and that they were being oppressed outside of the White House and government buildings and having people mock them. But this is where it started. We also start to see affirming transsexual medical treatment, which I'll get into in just a bit. And in 1969, the Stonewall riots happened. So the activism and the protests really culminated in Stonewall. There were several that happened before then, but Stonewall in 1969 was really the turning point. And a lot of people in the LGBTQ community will reference before Stonewall and after Stonewall as the different chapters in LGBTQ history, because things changed so much in 1970. So I'll mention more about the 1970s in just a bit, but let me just route back to the transgender medical treatment that started to happen in the 1960s. It's important to have that context. So a man by the name of Harry Benjamin, who eventually would start WPATH, but Harry Benjamin was a surgeon who started to treat trans women. His focus was on trans women, but he's credited with really providing gender affirmative care to the trans community. He wrote a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon, which talked about the benefits of helping people transition, helping trans women transition fully to being women through medical treatment, through the use of hormones, through the use of surgery. And it was because of his work that gender identity clinics started to appear throughout America. The first university gender identity clinic was Johns Hopkins University, but others started to pop up. And these were essentially research clinics. They started out really helping, kind of coming off from the work of Harry Benjamin. They wanted to start a research program, seeing how it would be to help people transition to women using gender affirming medical care, hormones and surgery. And this started out as a very extensive process, oftentimes a years-long process. So, they might have to have at least 2 years of psychotherapy. Members of their family would need to be interviewed. And they would need to show that they had lived in that gender before having the surgery. So it was a very, very extensive process, but this started in the 1960s. Okay, so I'm going to shift to the 1970s. And here the prevailing discourse was that homosexuality and transsexuality was abnormal, sad, shameful, and funny. So it was no longer, no longer illegal necessarily, at least fully. It was no longer considered a crime so much. And it was considered less an illness. but it was still considered abnormal throughout the 1970s. It was generally not okay to be out. But the challenges became even stronger in the 70s. There was a real spirit of revolution. So we see the beginning of an annual Gay Pride Day. There was increased visible activism happening on a regular basis, especially in cities. This is when safe neighborhoods and community centers started to form throughout the country. So you have like little pockets of neighborhoods in places like New York City, San Francisco, and other cities that were kind of safe zones with gay businesses and everything. And then political lobbying starts to happen. So discriminatory laws get challenged. LGBTQ people start to get into politics. You start to see LGBTQ people being out and politically visible. And then, as I mentioned, homosexuality was removed from the DSM as a mental health disorder in 1973. And on a clinical level, we start to see the beginning of gay affirmative psychotherapy, and that was largely influenced by feminism, which was happening in the 1970s. So gay affirmative psychotherapy basically said to the client when they came to therapy that there's nothing wrong with you. The problem is not you, the problem is a patriarchal society that starts with putting down women, but that also filters out to, putting down other people as well, to marginalizing other people. And you are now susceptible to that. So it's you living in this patriarchal, harmful society that's the problem. It's not you. So in our work together, we're not going to work to change you. We're going to help you learn to accept yourself and deal with living in a hostile world. That was very different from what the therapy looked like, for the most part, before the 70s, which was focused on changing the person's sexuality. So this was a very different approach in the 70s. And again, because of feminism, right? So there were some key clinical advances in the 1970s. As I said, it was homosexuality removed from the DSM. Gay affirmative therapy was adopted. Bisexuals started to be recognized a little bit more in the late 1970s. A man by the name of Fritz Klein wrote a book called The Bisexual Option, and he came up with a grid that conceptualized sexuality as being more multi-dimensional than just, are you attracted to a man or attracted to a woman? And I'll introduce that grid as a possible strategy in our next training. And then Vivian Cass developed the first lesbian and gay identity development model. An identity development model had never been presented before this. And to this day, Cass's identity development model is still the foundational model that we use to reference identity development with queer people. Throughout the 70s and then up to the 1980, there were important shifts in transgender care and treatment. So first, in 1979, those university gender clinics that I mentioned earlier that started in the 60s, they started to close. The reason they started to close was because they were saying that the research found that that medical transition did not help with gender dysphoria. And so, basically they said, it's not working, to alleviate this person's gender dysphoria. In retrospect, in hindsight, what we can see that they were not accounting for is that even though these folks had transitioned, they were still going back out into a hostile environment. By the time they had transitioned, they had lost all their family, all their friends. Being transgender was deeply unpopular in society and was seen as very, very pathological. So they had lost everyone in their community. So what they were probably experiencing was a depression and a deep sense of grief about that, and minority stress, a great sense of minority stress. But what happened as a result of that is that transgender care started to be privatized in the 1980s. So it shifted away from these gender clinics, and then private surgeons in the 1980s started to take on medical transition cases. So endocrinologists and surgeons started to do this. And at this time, Harry Benjamin, who started this whole movement, created his association, the International Gender Dysphoria Association, and he created the standards of care for gender transition, which we still use today. And those have changed, I would say, evolved over time. There's always a review of them, like every couple of years, and I will go over the current standards of care later in next week. And then as a setback, transsexualism was added to the DSM in 1980. So homosexuality had been removed, but transsexualism was added in the 80s. So in the 1980s, the prevailing discourse was the same. It was still pretty abnormal and shameful to be homosexual or transsexual. It was often considered funny. It was very common for it to be made fun of in the media, on TV, movies, stand-up comedy, you name it, very common. And this was also the period of AIDS. So homosexuals became associated with AIDS. And it was a real setback from the revolution that was started in the 1970s. The gay and lesbian community experienced a lot of momentum in the 1970s. But when AIDS hit in the 80s, they had to stop and really focus on survival. And so it was a setback in that way, as well as them also being, really scapegoated around the AIDS epidemic. So during the challenges that were happening at that time, were that one silver lining was that lesbians and gay men unified for AIDS care and activism. Back in the 70s, lesbians and gay men were actually on separate tracks. They actually saw themselves having different needs. So what was initially the gay movement became the gay and lesbian movement. And so you start to see the formation of the acronym, because it was no longer gay, it was gay and lesbian. And then the Harry Benjamin Association was formed, and then there were more healthcare providers for gender transition. So those were some challenges to the prevailing discourse. There was also prevailing homonormative discourse. And I'm going to get to talking more about homonormativity in a bit. But this is really an important part of the discussion as well. I've talked about the heteronormative discourse throughout history, but there was also homonormative discourse that really started in the 70s and 80s, once gay men and lesbians gained visibility. And by homonormative, I mean that there's a sense that there's a right way, there's a normal way to be gay or queer. So there's heteronormativity, but there's also homonormativity. And some of that homonormative discourse in the 70s and the 80s included these things. First, the focus was on white gay men and lesbians. In fact, the history books tell us with certainty that the Stonewall riots were headed by trans women of color. But that's not what history ended up remembering and celebrating. And so there was really, a priority given, and there was a priority given to white gay men and lesbians. People of color were essentially invisible in the movement. There was also the exclusion and erasure of bisexual people, and the exclusion and erasure of trans people. Notice that I said the gay and lesbian movement. It was not the LGBT movement at that time. And the medical focus, on the medical transition focus, was on binary trans women. Trans men were not, there was no study on trans men at that time. So these were, there was kind of like a way to be gay that was seen as that was normalized. So at this time, just like there were challenges to prevailing heteronormative discourse, there were challenges to prevailing homonormative discourse during these years. So notably during the 80s, people of color, communities of color, the African-American community the Latinx community, Asian and Pacific Islander communities started to form their own AIDS organizations because they saw that a lot of the financial support was happening in the white communities, right? In the white male AIDS support centers. So there was a recognition that they had to normalize, or excuse me, they had to mobilize to make things happen for themselves. So that is key right there. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Bisexual support groups and publications started to form in the 1980s, especially since bisexual people were also affected by the AIDS epidemic. There was more transgender activism starting to happen, especially in the late 80s and early 90s. And the privatization of trans healthcare started to include trans men in the 1980s. So I mentioned that, you'll have some people who lived through the history. You will, if you work with older clients in their 50s and up, they will likely have had some experience with the AIDS epidemic. So it's important to understand how that affected them. In the 1990s, there were some key advances. First, there was increased AIDS funding and the end of the AIDS epidemic. So this epidemic had gone on for 15 or 16 years. The presidential administration at that time did not put any money into the funding of AIDS research. So AIDS activists, people in the gay and lesbian community and the transgender community had to mobilize to try to get that research to happen. So in the 90s, thanks to the activism that happened around then, and then we had a different presidential administration that did end up funding AIDS research, AIDS drugs did come about and changed the game radically. So by 1996, we saw the introduction of antiretroviral HIV medication, which changed everything. So people on their deathbeds, literally on their deathbeds, who thought they were going to die, took this medication and started to live. They had a full life ahead of them. And there's still people to this day that had that experience, who you may see in your practice, who thought they were going to die and had an existential crisis because of that, and it took years for them to kind of figure out what their life was about. And it also meant that the community was able to move out of survival and into thriving again. So people started mobilizing in a different way. And with that, we started to see more gay and lesbian media visibility in the 1990s, more gay and lesbian storylines, celebrities, that we already know of, I'm sure, started to come out. And this was huge. The 90s is sometimes known as the gay visibility movement. So very key. And there's more trans and bi inclusion. And so we now see in the 1990s the creation of the LGBT acronym at this time. So essentially we went from the gay movement to the gay and lesbian movement to the LGB movement in the 80s. And then by the 90s, we're in the LGBT movement. So I really want to highlight the introduction and the integration of the word queer in the community. That starts to happen in the 90s. And that starts to happen in two key ways. First, through the activism of a group called Queer Nation. Queer Nation was just a real radical group who would go into straight spaces, it's just straight mainstream spaces, and be openly queer. They would just be themselves. They would have public displays of affection. They would dress the way they want. They would just, be fully themselves, And they had a slogan that went, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it. We're here, we're queer, get used to it." And they would chant that over and over again. And their idea was to take back or reclaim the word queer, which up to this point had been an epithet for people who were sexually and gender variant, right? So that was a big thing that happened. There was a real spirit of reclaiming this word. And then along with that, in academic circles and in clinical circles, we start to hear about queer theory. Queer theory, it really had such an influence on the culture at this time and really has so much to do with where we're at today that I really want to spend a little bit of time on it. And this also came about in the 1980s. It was also an attempt to reclaim the term queer, to normalize it, to say this is not a bad thing, this is a good thing, this is to be celebrated. So queer theory, has different influences. It's influenced by LGBT activism, which focuses on institutional power, suppressing gender and sexual minorities. It's also influenced by feminism, which I mentioned earlier. Feminism focuses on the systemic power that privileges men and masculinity. And that in turn, it marginalizes, it suppresses other marginalized groups. But primarily queer theory was influenced by something called postmodernism, which started to be prevalent in the 1990s. So postmodernism challenges a different kind of power. Postmodernism challenges what's called discursive power, or the power of language and discourse. I've been referencing this in some way throughout the talk about history. So much of the power that had been happening was through discourse, was through the language that had been established, and that became a part of the institutions. Postmodernism says that, we communicate through language, and language is so powerful that we start to assume it as truth. We start to assume the words and the ideas as truth, right? They get so in our bones, but actually they're just concepts. They're constructs that we kind of take on and we assume as truth. So postmodernism challenged this idea of universal or objective truth, right? And it says that reality for the most part is socially constructed. And in this context, in the context of queerness, sexual and gender identity, it says sexuality and gender is socially constructed. What is considered normal sexuality and gender has been socially constructed. So this was the opposite of what was known as modernism prior to the 90s. Modernism said that there are experts that we need to listen to, right? We go to an expert, this person knows what they want, and we listen to the expert. And that was included in therapy. You go to therapy and you listen to the expert. The expert knows what's going on. Postmodernism said, actually, the client is the expert in their own life. And we as the therapists, our job is to help them connect to their own expertise and to kind of facilitate a process around that. So that had, a great influence on how therapists started to work with LGBTQ or queer clients starting in the 90s. So, and next week when I get into strategies, I'll talk about some, postmodern strategies to bring into the work with clients. So just real briefly, I'll say some key tenets of queer theory. And I will say that these are just things that are going to thread throughout the training. This is kind of the spirit of queer theory, and I'll be mentioning these periodically. But these are key tenets of queer theory. Most notably, it is about deconstructing dominant discourse of sex and gender, of questioning, what we've been taught is normal and not normal, right? Or what's healthy and not healthy, right? And we may help the client to do that, to deconstruct that as well. And that also means, and by the way, these tenets really feed into each other, right? They're all very interconnected. So deconstructing dominant discourse also means challenging binaries, right? Things aren't necessarily one thing or the other. It's also a very postmodern view, right? So the idea of, as Kinsey challenged, homosexual, heterosexual, there's not necessarily a binary there. There's not necessarily a binary of male and female. And we challenge other binaries as well, right? With families, families are supportive or they're not supportive. Well, if you're working with queer theory, it's not just one or the other. There's a spectrum to everything. There's a sense of wholeness to everything. It also challenges the notions of fixed identities. So if someone identifies as gay, for example, they might shift later on in their own journey and processing to understanding that they're bisexual, right? So again, that's an example of of partnering with the client in their understanding of themselves, and not saying we're the expert and saying, well, if you said you were gay, so you must be gay, that must be fixed. No, not necessarily, because people's journeys change over time. Also, a key tenet is intersectionality. People's sexual and gender identity does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of their other lived experiences, especially, other marginalized lived experiences. And I'll certainly be saying more about that in the next section. Sex positivity is also a key tenet of queer theory. It goes along with questioning what's normal, what's abnormal when it comes to sex. I'll be talking about sex more in a bit. And also political resistance. And that basically means, challenging dominant discourse, really just resisting it for the sake of connecting with, what's true for the individual, what feels true and authentic for the individual. All right, so there were also clinical shifts for trans people throughout the 90s. Notably, there were informed consent models for trans healthcare that started in the late 90s, especially in urban trans care clinics in San Francisco, in New York. These informed consent models basically were more straightforward than the Harry Benjamin standards of care. So if someone wanted, it said that if someone wanted to medically transition, that they didn't need to go through a whole process for it. It was enough that they were an adult, they were a consenting adult, and if they were able to understand the risks and the benefits of the procedure, that they were able, that they could be approved for a medical transition. So those models started to happen in some clinics. Transsexuality was changed to gender identity disorder in 2000, and then gender identity disorder was changed to gender dysphoria in the DSM. So now it's known as gender dysphoria, which many of you may know. And there is a big debate about that, of whether gender dysphoria should be listed as a mental health disorder. And then by 2013, trans-affirming care practices started to be developed in clinics. Also, insurance started to accept gender-affirming medical care. So many insurance panels now will now pay for things like hormone replacement therapy and gender-affirming surgeries with the proper letter from the therapist. So there have been key advances in the last 20 years that are so important. There's been so much movement in the last 20 years. Now there's more emphasis on transgender activism and visibility. We started to have the first trans march in 2004. Because of queer theory, now we have the idea of gender queer, questioning the gender binary, which I will get more into later, don't worry. Trans and queer inclusion and starting families, same-sex marriage, increased visibility for LGBTQ families. So people who are LGBTQ, gay, lesbian, transgender, are now starting families, becoming parents. There are increased GSAs in schools, gay straight alliances in schools all over the country where I never thought I would see them. Kids are coming out sooner. So we're working with younger and younger clients. And so now LGBTQ has been added to, the Q has been added to the acronym. So I'll get to current trends where we are today, but I will take some time to answer some questions if any have come up around the history. So let's see what people, and there may be some comments as well. I'm going in the chat and seeing if there's anything.
Hey, Aaron, I'm looking in the chat and I just see a lot of comments.
Okay.
People sharing some things, but I do not see any question. But if y'all have a question, you can unmute during this time.
Okay. But some positive comments.
Oh yeah, all good stuff, all good stuff.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, we can take maybe a few minutes for questions if anyone has any.
We had Eden said that she's like in, he or she, sorry, is like in the course thus far. As a queer person, this is affirming and feels like I can provide the necessary tools. Much appreciated. Kelly stated, I was at a Pride last weekend and they were having a voguing contest. And I was so excited to know that I was watching what was part of historical queer resistance. Made me feel so connected.
That's beautiful.
I have a question. When
Yes.
you were talking about the history a little bit and the 50s and 60s and the sort of the polarization of the races, did you also find that in the leather community and sort of the BDS community around the activism as well? Or did you find that there was more blended diversity within that group around the activism pieces?
Oh, and did you mean
leather?
the 70s and 80s, during the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, because you were talking about how they were kind of, it was seen more as the white, movement.
It was a primarily white movement.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about, especially in the leather community, where diversity, I think, has been a little bit more embraced. Was there any sort of, was that still the same thing back then, or active?
I think that's a great question. And I don't really know the answer to it, but I'd love to research that. I mean, your question seems to be in the leather community. In the leather community it started to be formed really like in the 60s, and then it went into the 70s. But your question seems to be, was there more embracing of diversity in that community at that time?
Yeah, and especially around the activism, because what I still see now is that still a very blended community with strong activism, even now, and
Yes.
the level of acceptance between just all people of any identifying, whether it's race, whether it's identity, whether it's just like, it's almost like, hey, if you are a sexual misfit, come on, we got you, kind of feeling with the leather overlay of values and things that go along with being part of that leather community and concepts of old guard and all of that stuff. But I just was wondering if you knew any pieces of that.
I don't, but I think it's a beautiful question. The leather community is, I'll get a little bit into kink and BDSM, just touch on it a little bit. But they are considered, I think they would consider themselves to be a radical community. And the more radical, the more inclusive people tend to be, in my experience. More inclusive groups tend to be. It wouldn't surprise me if that were the case in the 70s and 80s. So I will also say that there were probably anomalies to what I was saying in general, because the overall encompassing discourse was this was a white movement. That doesn't mean that there weren't pockets of the community that weren't challenging that. And I'm sure that there were, and I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if the leather community was a part of challenging that. Yeah, that's a great question, though. I'm going to look into it. I'm going to do some research in the leather community and see if I can learn about that.
Well, the reason I say that, the leather archives, there's several annexes and libraries of leather archive material, and having looked at some of those, being able to see some of those exhibits, we saw the inclusivity a little bit. So I was just wondering, again, is it a more radical pocket, like you mentioned, just because of the nature of the affiliation? It might be just more accepting in general. And I also wanted to say thank you for your work with AIDS folks. I did the same thing in the early 90s. I did hospice work with folks who were dying when other hospice workers wouldn't go in. So when you brought up the AIDS epidemic and that impact, that that's a near and dear subject to my heart. So I thank you for your work in that community as well.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you for your work. Yeah, thank you, Stacy. Let me just do a time check. Time for one more question if anyone wants to ask. Otherwise, I'll just move on.
We do have one hand raised.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah. Are they unmuted?
I don't think we can hear you. Sorry.
Oh, can you unmute yourself? This is MHS 411.
I know they put, it looks like they're unmuted, but the sound might be a little
Oh,
less.
they put it in chat.
Mhm.
Oh, what's the difference between gay and queer? Okay, I'm going to get into that in the next section. That's a great question. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and move on if that's okay. Then hopefully we can, yeah, take our break soon. Okay, so where does that bring us today, right? What's our understanding today, given all the history and that's unfolded? So increasingly, and again, this is a lot to do with the influence of queer theory, increasingly we're non-binary and inclusive as a community. Okay, so I'll talk about what do those terms mean. What is non-binary? What is inclusive? So basically, instead of the acronym, we use the acronym a lot now, LGBTQ, but we might also use these other acronyms, which I see being used increasingly, SOGI, which just stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. It's just kind of considered more inclusive, like kind of more of an umbrella term. Because with the LGBTQ acronym, there's a spirit of being inclusive. And so what happens is more and more letters get added on. And then, or we can say GSM, gender or sexual minorities. So more and more I'm hearing clinicians say that they work with SOGI, right? Maybe they won't say they work with LGBTQ, they'll say they work with SOGI. That's totally fine. You will hear me often kind of use all these different terms, LGBTQ, SOGI, GSM, SGM, and also the umbrella term queer. You also hear me say queer, which is an umbrella term, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. So non-binary also means that, okay, so I'll talk about non-binary first and then inclusivity. So non-binary, as I mentioned in the tenets of queer theory, means that sexuality and gender can't be neatly categorized in a binary way. So when we work with this community, what we want to do is challenge ourselves around binary models of thinking, because our clients may not be thinking that way. They may not experience their lives, their inner selves that way. So we want to be open to non-binary models. For our purposes, I focus on these three categories. I focus on sexual orientation, gender expression, and gender identity. I will also say when it comes to this community, we might also include biological sex, that is also non-binary. There are people, for example, who are intersex, right? So that just goes to show you that even sex, even when we talk about biological sex, that's not even binary. When you look at not just, humans, but other species. There are species who are not just male or female. Also, sexual desire is non-binary. More and more we see people in, or I should say the LGBTQ community is more embracing people who identify as either asexual or demisexual, right? Meaning they don't always feel sexual attraction, or sometimes they have to experience an emotional connection with someone before they experience attraction. So biological sex and sexual desire are other categories I just want to note, but for our purposes, I'm going to focus on these three categories for this training. So sexual orientation, gender expression, and gender identity all can be seen on kind of a spectrum. So sexual orientation I touched on with the Kinsey work, and I think that is often easier in my experience for people to grasp. But then there's sexual expression and gender identity. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between these two because I often get asked about that. So gender identity is how people feel inside that they are. Gender expression is how a person expresses themselves. It has to do with the energy that they put out. And how they present. So sometimes I'll say, in terms of myself, I use myself as an example. My gender identity is male. I said earlier I was cisgender male, meaning I'm not trans. I'm a cisgender male. So my identity is very much male. But if you were to ask me about my gender expression, which is between feminine and masculine, I'd put myself somewhere in the middle. I'm not like masculine, but I'm not really feminine. I'm somewhere in the middle. Sometimes what's also helpful is to talk about, femme men, especially femme gay men. There are I would say I'm somewhat a femme gay man. So there are femme gay men. So those are men who very much identify as male, but identify as feminine in their gender expression. Or we could also talk about butch lesbians, right? A butch lesbian doesn't identify as a male. They identify very much as female, but they have a masculine energy. They express themselves in a masculine way. Okay, so when we're talking about sexuality and gender, I'm going to talk about, reference all three of these things. And hopefully that makes sense to everyone, but I'll have another chance to answer questions if people need clarity about that. Because there's also what's called passing privilege in the community, right? So it's like, if you are a masculine gay man, right, then you have some passing privilege. But if you are a feminine gay man, you have the gender, you have this sexual orientation of gay, but you don't have as much privilege if you have a feminine energy. Again, I'm happy to come back to that if people need a little bit more help distinguishing those. When I talk to people, even when I talk to clients, sometimes that a singular line is not enough to capture people's experience of sexuality and gender. So sometimes I bring in like a triangle to make it more multi-dimensional, because with gender, you might have male, female, but sometimes people don't have a sense of gender. Some people identify as agender. And then same with gay and straight, like some people may, I may not just identify as gay or straight, but there's some spectrum between asexual and not. And this is just another model to present to you. It's something else I might bring in with clients when I explore sexuality and gender with them. So I may just ask them, what feels more right for you to use just this straight line right now? If we're like, let's say we're exploring sexual orientation, can I just use this straight line with you right now? Or does this feel more accurate? So again, I'm trying to tune into the client as the expert in their own experience. But the point is to just kind of step out of this model that we're probably familiar with, because we are so seeped in the dominant cultural narrative of this binary, and knowing that other clients and other people hold it for themselves in a much richer way. Okay, and so inclusive, that's the other spirit of the zeitgeist today. What does it mean to be inclusive? So there has been an effort to capture as many people in the acronym as possible, as I'm sure many of you know, right? So this acronym, and we could continue adding more letters to it, but this acronym has most of the terms that we understand today that are regularly used: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. I think most of you know what those mean. I will say that today, bisexual, especially with young people, bisexual tends to mean attracted to more than one gender. It used to mean attracted to both genders, but now with younger people, there's a sense that there's more than one gender. So bisexual now means attracted to more than one gender. Again, especially with younger people. And then there's transgender, queer. Okay, so queer is an umbrella term that encompasses the whole community. So sometimes I said earlier that instead of using the acronym, I might just say the queer community. That tends to be a generational thing. Younger people, it kind of really embrace this term queer. Again, it's a reclaiming of the term. It's a celebration of difference and owning one's truth and authenticity. And the difference between gay and queer is gay is, when I say I'm a gay or queer man, I'm comfortable with both terms. Gay means that my sexual orientation is towards men. Queer means that my experience of sexuality and gender does not match the dominant cultural narrative. So queer is just a more encompassing term. And I am comfortable identifying as gay, and I'm also comfortable identifying as queer, because both, I feel, speak to my experience. Gay speaks more specifically to my experience, but queer also speaks to my experience. And a lot more young people are identifying as queer, because, especially if they don't want to put themselves in a box, right? They want to be more open to possibilities. They might identify as queer in terms of their gender or their sexuality. Questioning kind of speaks for itself, people who just don't know. So that can also be included in the acronym. Asexual, I already mentioned. Intersex, I've mentioned. Two-spirit, I talked about earlier. That's often in the acronym. And pansexual, sometimes you will hear about pansexual people. And just to clue you into what that is, pansexual is very similar to bisexual, but the internal dynamics are different. A pansexual person would say that that they are often led by the emotional connection before the physical connection with a person. So a bisexual person would say that they tend to lead a little bit more with a physical attraction. A pansexual person would say that the emotional connection comes first and then the sexual attraction. But both bisexual and pansexual people tend to be attracted to more than one gender. In fact, I often see support groups for bisexual/pansexual people. And I have this slide of other categories just to acknowledge that there are other categories. And this is where I say it's important to kind of pull back and I not get you into the weeds, because you know, it can sometimes it's not always helpful to get into trying to figure out what all of these terms mean. The ones that I just went over with you are the most common terms, but it's also important to know that people in the community may identify themselves in many different ways. And as I'll say later, it's important to always check in with the client about what does that mean for them. That's always more important than the technical definition of a term. But you can really look any of these up online. They're very easy to educate yourself on. I mentioned agender earlier. It's kind of a sense of having no gender. Gender fluid means, kind of going back and forth, not having a fixed sense of gender identity, but, you may feel masculine one day, maybe you may feel feminine another day. Gray sexual is like being asexual, but kind of in a gray space, not having a consistent sense of sexual attraction. Scoliosexual is someone who's attracted to transgender people. So that's just to kind of give you a brief overview. I'll also add this NB. This is one that I'm hearing more and more now by young people. NB is a phonetic term for the letters NB, which mean non-binary. So a person, especially a young person who identifies as NB, means they identify as non-binary. They don't identify as male or female. They identify as somewhere in between. So, and yes, I will say more about that later. So inclusion also means intersectionality, which I spoke to earlier. So again, we now consider all social identities of LGBTQ people. We factor in what is it like to be a trans person, for example, who is a senior, right? Or a trans woman who is Black. A Black trans woman's experience is very different from a white trans woman's experience, or a trans woman who is from the Philippines, for example. Or education level, or even the intersection of gender and sexual orientation. That is an intersectionality. Someone who identifies as transgender and as lesbian. That in itself is an intersection. And also, and certainly ability, right? Someone who's a gay man who is able-bodied, their experience is going to be very different from someone who is in a wheelchair, for a gay man who's in a wheelchair. So when we assess our clients, when we work with them, and I'll get into this when I talk about working with clients, we always factor in the full lived experience. And this is just a symbol of that. Many of you have probably already seen this flag, but the pride flag used to be just the colors of the rainbow, but in many parts of the country, I would say that rainbow flag is still hanging, but in other parts, we've added the colors of black and brown in the conscious spirit of including black and brown people in the community. So to make it known that this is not just a white movement. And also, this is the Progress Pride flag, a conscious intention to include black and brown people and trans people in the community. So I see this flag more and more. So this is just symbolic of what I've been talking about. The colors on this end, these three colors here, the light blue, the lavender, the white, this is the trans flag, colors of the trans flag. All right, so I'm just going to briefly mention generational differences because this is important. If you work with a younger person versus work with an older person, they're going to hold these ideas very differently because they have different lived historical experiences. So the youngest generation, if you're working with people roughly the ages of 11 to 26, these folks have had the most experience to LGBT people growing up. They probably went to a school with a GSA. So they're more likely to explore and question their sexuality and gender and to identify as queer. They may even play around with it, right? I hear that a lot today. A lot of young people kind of experiment with being non-binary or sometimes being bisexual. It's just, considered a little bit more normal today. I would say, this is also in the context of where people live. If you live in a more progressive area, like a city, or even a suburb, this is more likely to be the case. But if you live in a smaller town, it's more conservative, maybe this isn't going to happen. Kid will still be in the closet, not feeling free to explore. So it's contextual. Millennials, people ages 27 to 42, again, this is generally speaking, they came to age in the media of gay visibility. They were coming to age in the 90s when people were coming out and there were, celebrities and characters on TV who were queer. They were influenced by queer theory. So they appreciate this non-binary framework and they're open to various identities. They're very likely to identify as queer. You may hear that a lot, but they also tend to, connect to a sub-tribe. So for example, like lesbians may, they all identify as queer, but they also like to hang out with other lesbians, for example. Whereas Generation Z, I find their friends are more diverse. Generation X, which is my generation, we came of age during the AIDS epidemic. That had a huge impact on people from that generation. They're probably to some degree have experienced some trauma from the AIDS epidemic. And we were mostly young adults when queer theory emerged. It was new to us, but exciting. And there is an openness among this generation generally to be, to new ideas of sexuality and gender, but often still a comfort with identifying with their subgroups and older categorized notion of LGBT. So gay men more likely to be comfortable hanging out with other gay men, for example. And baby boomers, the oldest generation, they obviously came up at the height of social discrimination, probably experienced the most amount of trauma, and they may find more comfort and sanctuary in their subgroups. They may even prefer older terminology. For example, it's not unusual for older trans women to like the term transsexual, for example. They may not like the new terminology. That's not true across the board, but you may find older people not wanting to use the term queer because they have such a negative association with it. So this is just something to be aware of, again, in the context of the history I talked about. And so today, I just want to identify some, kind of some key things that we're addressing today as providers. And I want to start with the status of conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is the idea, that old idea that you can change someone's sexual orientation. This is also called reparative therapy or sexual orientation change efforts, or SOCI. This was a movement that was started in the 90s when the gay visibility movement started to happen. And these two organizations, NARTH and ATCSI, really kind of started doing this therapy work with people who wanted to change their sexual orientation. It's very based in religious ideas as well as old kind of psychoanalytic principles. There is no valid research behind conversion therapy. In fact, every major medical, psychological, social work organization has come out against it and has said that at best it is ineffective, at worst it's harmful. And there are many, many stories out there. I have clients in my practice who have been deeply harmed and traumatized by conversion therapy when they were younger. So I put there a couple of quotes from just a couple of organizations. There are many more I could have put, but just to let you know, like some of the statements that these organizations have made against conversion therapy. Last time I checked, conversion therapy on youth was banned in 20 states and in Washington, D.C. I think Virginia is one of those states. And so that means that conversion therapy cannot be practiced on youth in those states. So there's been legislation passed, and it's been partially banned in 6 states, 1 territory, and several local jurisdictions. So even if it's not banned in certain states, there may be local jurisdictions in that states where it's illegal to practice conversion therapy on youth. And unfortunately, some states are starting to block some of these bans. There is an effort to, last I checked, was an effort to block the ban in Wisconsin. But these bans happen because of the research and the public statements that have been made. But there's also an effort to get conversion therapy banned in general, even with adults. So I just want to clarify that. Sometimes there will be clients who come to us saying that they want to change their sexual orientation. I always say that I cannot do that. There's no research that suggests that that is possible, to really change your sexual orientation or your gender identity. What I can do, what some clients would like to do, is learn to live with their sexual orientation and still maintain a certain lifestyle that they want, that fits with their, maybe their culture or their religious beliefs. That I can do, but I cannot change their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And also today, there has been obviously increased mainstream acceptance. So more public support for LGBTQ rights, more open LGBT celebrities and politicians, open and affirming churches. There's these gay-straight alliances in schools, which is incredible. So what that means for our work as providers is that, first, we have younger and younger people in our practice, more LGBTQ children and teens coming out than ever before. Clients are generally further along in their LGBTQ development when they start therapy. And then we and our clients also have increased access to resources. And generally, there's more increased safety. So we've seen across the country LGBTQ inclusion in anti-discrimination laws. There's hate crimes legislation, anti-bullying policies. A lot of these didn't exist 25 years ago. More increased mainstream support. So people are more likely to have allies in their friends and their family. So what this means for our work as providers is that we have increased time and energy to help the clients heal from their trauma. Whereas before, it might have been like helping clients survive, helping them through crisis mode. We also can help them focus on their relationship patterns and on developmental injuries and on integration of parts of self. All of these things I'll talk about next week. But we're talking about we can do more sophisticated work with LGBTQ clients than we ever could before because they're feeling safer and more accepted. However, there has also been social and political backlash. Sometimes when I do these trainings, there's people from all different parts of the country. And this might be the case in your region. I'm aware that I'm talking with people who are in more accepting parts of the country that do feel safe, much safer. But there are other parts of the country where there's been a lot of political backlash, and LGBTQ people are actually feeling less safe. So we actually have increased bullying and violence in those parts of the country. We have removal of LGBTQ inclusion in anti-discrimination laws. We have more legislation that discriminates, and more punishing from religious communities. So LGBTQ people who come from those communities, what I talked about just a minute ago doesn't apply to them. This does. So in that case, if you work in these communities, you're more likely to maybe be in a crisis mode with your clients. There's more crisis work. There's more focus on safety and resourcing, and needing to address very real fear of violence and the anxiety and triggering of trauma. So when I talk about social and political backlash, sometimes it can be helpful to give an example, because I could give lots of examples, but something that's pretty recent is, as most of you probably know, is the removal of gender affirming care for trans youth in different parts of the country, and how this is being politicized. And where this started was with this 2018 journal article out of Brown University, I think it was, citing research that there was social contagion happening among teenage and transitional age youth girls. So girls like between the ages of like 13 and 21. And it suggested that there were, these girls were suddenly experiencing gender dysphoria and wanted to become boys and were declaring themselves as trans. And the article indicated that this was happening because of social contagion, because this was becoming a popular idea among girls and that they were seeing it more on the internet and that they were being influenced by this. And the research was done through a survey of parents who were concerned about their young girls. And so the article was published based on the surveys of these parents. And a lot of the media and different legislatures grabbed hold of this article, and really a lot kind of sprang from this and said, see, this is happening because of social contagion. And so from that, there's been this whole movement to just stop gender affirming care with young kids in general, not just with girls. So the article suggested that, claiming gender dysphoria was a maladaptive coping mechanism among these kids. So when you look closer at the research, and one reason I'm talking about this is to give perspective, but this is also where if you work with young people, it's important to start to educate parents, to talk to parents about the research, what it's actually saying. There were flaws in this research. And notably those flaws were that the kids weren't interviewed. No one talked to the kids. They only talked to the parents. That the groups were very limited in terms of where they were coming from. These were parents from more conservative environments and more conservative families who were already talking to each other online. So it wasn't like it was a random sample of parents from around the country. They were talking to this group of parents. So what wasn't accounted for was, what was the kids' experience in the environment of those families in those communities, because no one talked to the kids. There may be reasons that young people suddenly come out when they're young. that have nothing to do with social contagion. So if they grow up in an environment, for example, where it doesn't feel safe just to explore their gender identity, or even where it doesn't even feel safe to acknowledge to themselves, to have an idea, and they don't have any education about it, that may be a reason that they don't they don't start talking about it until they're a teenager. And that has been the case with some of my teenage clients. So it's important to factor that in. And it's important that this is still a research hypothesis. The idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is the term that's often being used now, it's not a formal diagnosis. It's a research hypothesis. And it distorts the extensive assessment and preparation process that trained therapists do with trans and non-binary youth. I often say, if you go to a trans youth clinic, their assessment process is incredibly extensive. And it does all of the gender exploration work that a lot of the people are saying that should be done now. And a lot of stories about youth who kind of got premature gender affirming medical treatment and regret it are now out there in the media telling their stories. And I would say those are valid stories. They also distort the actual numbers of kids who are helped by gender affirming care. So that's just a little rundown for you of the background, and that's just a little bit of it gives you a taste of some of the discussion that I have to have with parents sometimes. Okay, so also we're almost done with this section. Consensual non-monogamy is a thing in the queer community that we hear more about. Consensual non-monogamy also happens with non-queer people, I will say, but because there is more kind of sexual exploration that happens in the LGBTQ community, you're more likely to hear about it then. So clients who want to open up their relationship, for example, or who want to experience, instead of a couple being in a throuple, or a quad. This is not unusual. And so it's just something for us as therapists to be aware of, because in the most recent survey of the study of people in consensually non-monogamous relationships was that they often felt judged or misunderstood by their therapist. And also today we're dealing with online dating and hookups. A lot of my clients, especially my gay male and trans clients, talk about going on these hookup sites like Grindr. This is sometimes referred to as like the modern day bathhouse, whereas like in the past, in the 70s, like gay men would go to the bathhouse to have sex and to hook up. It's happening on these apps. And not just hookups happen on these sites. People also date and form friendships. So it can be a positive thing. But just to know that clients bring this up, it's a part of their world. And there are mental health concerns being raised by clinicians, and they're starting to be researched now. There is a concern about this phenomenon of the variable ratio reinforcement, that happens with gambling, like, where you start a chat with someone and then get ghosted by that person. And then you want to do more, but you keep getting not many gains. And so people who are susceptible to depression, anxiety, guilt, compulsivity, that sort of thing, which is very common in the LGBTQ community, that can happen even more through these apps. So it's something to be aware of. And I've mentioned, sexuality through these last couple slides. I will be talking about sexuality in the next section. So I'll take some questions and then we'll take our break. We'll take our half-hour break. Okay. Yeah, someone said something about pedophiles. I will. Yeah, pedophiles are not mentioned in the inclusion, certainly. And I will say something about that. Not today, but next week. Okay. It looks like there are no more questions, so we can go ahead.
Sorry, Aaron.
That's okay.
Kelly said, can you speak a little more about how inside of the queer community, different generations may have different level? Oh, I think you already went over that level of acceptance, and how that might look in a therapeutic work. Kelly, I'm not sure if you answered that, but I know we went over the generation and how it might look.
I definitely went over the first part of the question, and I wonder if the question might have been asked before I did that section. But I will get into the therapeutic work next week for sure. Hello, welcome back. We're going to get started with the next section. We got an hour and a half left here. And this is the section on establishing safety and trust with LGBTQ clients. And as I said earlier, if you can get this down, you're more than halfway there to doing good work with the clients. So let's get started. And where I usually find is a good place to get started is with ourselves. Just doing a little bit of internal observation and internal work, because actually, as with all clients, it's important to be able to get to know our biases, our judgments, our assumptions, especially about sexuality and gender. I've talked a lot about the dominant discourse around sexuality and gender, these dominant cultural narratives around what's normal and not normal. All of us internalize these narratives. Even as a queer person, I will say I've internalized these narratives. So this is just what I'm going to do with you now is just an exercise in just starting to notice that for yourselves. So we're going to do a little exercise. It's a very simple exercise. It's just going to be about 3 minutes. And I'm just going to invite you to simply listen to my voice. I'm going to read you 3 clinical vignettes. All of these vignettes are very brief, and they're based on actual cases of mine. I've adjusted some of the specifics, but they're all based on actual cases. When I read you these vignettes, I just want you to just listen and imagine these as cases that you might actually have. Imagine this as a client sitting across the room from you, and sort of visualize it. And then notice what happens for you when you hear the vignette. Just kind of what are your emotional reactions, your body sensations, thoughts, concerns, any of that. And then when we're done with the exercise, I'm just going to invite people to just write very briefly in the chat, if they want to, what some of their reactions were to the different vignettes. So I'm going to invite you just to get in a comfortable position where you can just listen to my voice, whatever that is for you, and to just kind of go inside so you can visualize. And I'll start with the first vignette. So just listen to it and notice what happens for you. You're working with a 25-year-old man who identifies as gay. He has started opening up to you about his sexual exploration and most recent sexual adventures. He tells you that over the last weekend, he got together with 3 good friends, also gay men. He recounts his use of MDMA and cocaine with them, followed by group sex. He says that this situation helped him to feel safe and free enough to bottom or to have anal sex for the first time. He describes enjoying this experience once he started to relax. So just notice whatever happens for you as you hear those words, and imagine him across from you. And take note. Next vignette. You've been working with a couple in their 40s. One member of the couple identifies as a trans man, pronouns he, him. The other identifies as a queer woman, pronouns she, her. After working with you for several weeks on communication issues, they tell you that they would like to discuss opening up their relationship. They say that they have a satisfying sex life, but that he is increasingly curious about sex with men. She is encouraging of him exploring this side of his sexuality and even expresses openness in him having a boyfriend on the side. She is possibly interested in having a female sex buddy. Again, just notice what happens, take note, and I'll move on to the next. A 15-year-old client assigned female at birth, identifies as non-binary, and goes by the gender-neutral pronouns they, them. They started meeting with you to address family issues, gender identity, and general teenage angst. A few sessions into therapy, they tell you that they are interested in pursuing top surgery, a removal of breast tissue. They express feeling certain this surgery will help them to feel more aligned with their sense of self. They emphasize that they are not interested in hormones at this time. Again, notice, take note, and I'll move on to the last one. You are seeing a transgender woman in her early 30s and who has begun her social transition. She has been increasingly accepting her trans identity and in turn has been more aware of her body dysphoria. As she discusses her body dysphoria, she speaks softly of always hating it, quote, down there. She begins to slowly reveal to you her practice of sounding, which she explains is the insertion of a thin metal rod into the urethra. She describes this as offering her a sense of vaginal penetration. Again, notice what happens, and we'll conclude the exercise there. And at this point, I just want to invite people, if you feel moved to do so, to put in the chat just what your reactions were to any of the vignettes. Maybe some of them stand out for you. And just put it out there. I just want to get a sense of what people are noticing for themselves. And again, there's no right or wrong. There's just what happened for you. So let's see, who would like to put anything in? Okay, safety, 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 sadness, and healthy issues. Okay, yeah. The ones more sexually charged made me feel uncomfortable, which is very common. Yeah, so when clients bring up sexuality to us, especially when it's not something we're used to, it can bring on discomfort. Yeah, and safety is it was a big concern people brought up for them. Number one, safety. That's great. I'm going to talk about that in just a bit. Safety, big one. Good. Okay. Needing to be aware of traditional relationship dynamics and adjusting expectations to each unique couple. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, sometimes we bring in our ideas of what is a relationship. It can be traditional notions of that. Trust issues between the couple. I found the mention of substance abuse stood out to me. That's a common one. Substance abuse is often a red flag. I feel excited for some of this exploration and empathy and concern for the hard parts. Well, that's wonderful. So that indicates like you're noticing an openness to these clients and their stories. Great. Okay. All right. So that's a sum of what people brought in. Great. Okay. And whatever whatever you were experiencing in those vignettes, just take note. You may have found that some of the vignettes, some of what you heard made you uncomfortable. Some of it caused you concerns, brought up really important questions for you. You may have noticed that there was maybe a couple of vignettes were more comfortable for you than others. Some you felt open to. Maybe you felt open to all of these stories. So the idea is just to start to get into the habit of checking in with yourself, noticing what makes you feel uncomfortable and what doesn't, because it all starts when we're working with sexual and gender identity and kind of deconstructing dominant notions around it. It starts with just noticing how have we been conditioned, right? The more generally, that's how we want to set the stage. We want to set the stage by checking our biases and judgments and cultivating openness about sexuality and gender, which, is pretty foundational, pretty basic, but I think it really needs to be emphasized and said. When we have that foundation of just noticing our biases and being open, that takes us a long way with the clients. So in general, the more open we are about gender and sexuality, the more effective we will be in working with this community. So you probably know already, you've experienced clients pick up on our energy. I'm going to talk about what the current language is, the right things to say, to develop credibility with your clients. But sometimes, even if we're saying the right things and we're using the right language, clients can pick up on our discomfort and our lack of openness. So this is really about just starting with that, starting with just exercising a sense of openness about sexuality and gender with our clients. So you may find that when you sit with issues of sexuality and gender that clients bring into you, whatever that is, that may be how they identify, what they call themselves, what some of their practices are. It may be how they present to you. It may be like clinical issues they bring up, but whatever they bring into the room, sometimes because of our own conditioning around sexuality and gender, we can feel a little kind of uncomfortable or ungrounded, not sure where to go in the session. So it's important to have a way to just kind of keep you anchored and grounded, and to know that it's okay to not know. You don't always have to know. Part of it is just being curious with our clients. So I just have 3 questions to keep in mind, and these are basically grounded in queer theory and postmodernism. The first one is based in queer theory, but it's also based in harm reduction, and people emphasize this in the chat: safety. Number 1, is the client safe? Whatever they're talking about, right? If they're talking about, just doing something with their bodies, they're talking about some kind of sexual practice or drug use, are they safe? It's okay to assess for safety in an open, non-judgmental way. That's number 1. And I call these the 3 S's, just to, kind of as a sort of model. The next is, listen to the client's speech. What language do they use? Queer clients can often, talk about things that we're unfamiliar with. I showed you that slide with the list of varying identities. You may hear an identity you've never heard before. What is that? Okay, well, what does the client call themselves? We're just going to listen to the client and follow their lead. And that goes for other things like practices, like sexual practices, or any kinds of behaviors or ways they move about the world. Listen to how they define it for themselves and use their language. And finally, significance. What does it mean for the client? If you're unsure, that's always a great thing to go back to exploring with the client. What does that mean to you? So again, when a client is calling themselves something, I said this earlier, if they refer to themselves as bisexual, for example, I might be inclined to say, what does bisexual mean for you? I have a sense of what it is for me. Can you tell me what that means for you? Or any kind of practice that they're bringing in. I could look at any of these examples and we could find a place for that question, right? The group sex and the use of drugs. What does that mean for the client? We really want to first of all, make sure that the client is safe, and then break that down and see, what does that really mean for the client? There are, you can look at the same situation and it can mean something very different for different clients. I often use the example of like a kink BDSM scene, right? Let's say you have a client who talks to you and they like to get tied up and spanked. For one client, that's about, when you break it down with them and you say, what does that mean for you? What's important to you about that? Explore it. One client might say, I have a job where I'm in control all the time. I have to be in control of everything in my life. And doing that kind of role play is freeing to me. It is actually healthy for me to do that. And I feel better. And I have a regular partner I do it with, someone who I really trust, right? And we have safe words and stuff. For another client, you can explore that same scenario and they'll say, I feel terrible afterwards. It's re-traumatizing to me to do that. And I don't always trust the person I do it with. I don't have a regular partner, but and I don't know why I do it. I just feel compelled to do it. So see, it's the same practice, it's the same behavior, but it means very different things to do different people. So you'll find yourself going on different tracks there. I often also use the example of when a couple likes to watch porn together during sex. I'm doing couples therapy. To one couple, that may be a connecting practice. It may be something that helps their sex life. Another couple may find it disconnecting. Maybe one person likes it, but the other person doesn't want to do it. So what does it mean is a really key question that can kind of help ground you in what direction you're going to go. So in this section, since this is about sexuality and gender and establishing safety in those regards, I'm going to talk about sex, how to hold sex, the subject of sex as a provider, and then how to hold gender. And then at the end of the section, I'll kind of provide you with a list of comprehensive do's and don'ts, right, to kind of sum up everything. So again, this is about establishing safety and rapport. So that a lot of that is about how do we hold sexuality with clients. In the spirit of queerness and queer theory, a big part of holding sex is through the lens of sex positivity. That's a really important idea. You know, we don't automatically pathologize sexuality. We might explore what a sexual practice means for a client and find out that it is, for them, it's negative or pathological, but we never assume that first. We start with the idea that sex in all its forms is an important means of self-expression. So that includes the other bullet points listed here. Sex is not just intercourse. It's not always intercourse. So when queer people talk about having sex, you know, for straight people, you may think about, you know, penile-vaginal sex, but for queer people, sex doesn't necessarily mean intercourse, right? There's no right way. Sex for queer people a lot is being in the sexual response cycle, right? Which is basically, you know, the 4 steps. It's desire, arousal, climax, and resolution, right? So you're in that response cycle, you're having sex. Sometimes the sex roles are fixed and sometimes they're not. Sometimes someone may identify as a certain sex role, like as a submissive or as a dom or dominant or as a top or as a bottom. Sometimes people may identify, but not always. Some people are more what they say versatile. So again, we're just being open and exploring that with the clients. We mentioned the kink BDSM community earlier. There is a kind of a contingent within the gay community of kink and BDSM, sometimes called the leather community. Kink, BDSM, fetishes are not unusual things to explore in the LGBTQ community. Sometimes in the dominant discourse, these things are seen as abnormal or shameful. They're not in the LGBTQ community because sexual exploration, sex positivity is also normal. So these are just seen as other ways of expressing one's sexuality, and they can be done in very positive, healthy ways for people. And just so you're clear, a kink is basically an experience that turns people on. It's like something like a role play. BDSM stands for bondage, domination, sadomasochism. So it is a sort of role play that can be situational in certain scenarios, or it can be more pervasive in people's lives. Sometimes in the leather and kink community that can happen. Like people play these roles all the time, you know, like father, son, that kind of thing. And fetishes are things or body parts that turn people on. And BDSM is encompassing of kink and fetish, right? Because it uses kind of leather objects, as well as role play. So that's just to give you a little, you know, context for those terms. Also, in the context of sex positivity, I mentioned this earlier with consensual non-monogamy, open relationships are common. They can vary with each partner, or with each partner unit, I should say. It's best not to assume monogamy with queer couples, but it's also good not to assume non-monogamy. I always ask couples, or if clients are in a relationship, when I do an intake or an assessment, I just ask, what is the status of your relationship? I never assume that it is a closed relationship. And sometimes it is a closed, committed, monogamous relationship, but my question kind of indicates that I'm open to that shifting, you know? And I mentioned this earlier, sometimes pornography is often considered normal and even healthy. It can be a source of education for people in the LGBTQ community. In the heterosexual or straight world, pornography can often be considered as misogynistic, right? It's an industry run by men where women are objectified. This is often not the case in the queer community. This is not to say that there is not unhealthy pornography out there. There is. In general, pornography is considered often healthy and educational, which is important for queer people because that kind of sex education doesn't come in their development, right? In their school education. And generally there's more openness about the sex industry. So, sex workers, sexual surrogates, masseurs, you may hear about clients, kind of engaging with the sex industry or being a part of the sex industry. And again, it comes back to that question, what does it mean for the client? Sexual attraction and relationships tend to be towards others in similar social subtribes, but not always. Like, for example, the kink or BDSM community would be a subtribe. There are certain kinds of sub-communities that, stick together socially, or there's sexual and romantic attractions that exist within those groups, but not always. So again, being aware of some kind of some ways of being in the community, but also being open to that shifting. For everything I've said, sex can also be, quote, vanilla, right? Not all queer people, are wild and crazy and like to do all these, everything. Some queer people are monogamous. They want to be in just a straight on monogamous relationship. So we never want to assume anything about our queer clients. And some queer people don't have sex at all. There are those queer people who identify as asexual. So when I say openness, I really mean it in the broadest sense. Having talked about sex positivity, it's also important to note this new sex critical lens we're hearing about. It was presented by a therapist named Julie Tilson, who writes about using queer theory in practice. And she's talked about how clarifying being sex critical is important, because sex positivity has come to be misunderstood as, everything is positive, which it's not. So there's needed to be some clarity about that. And it's also stepped away from the binary of positivity and negativity. So being sex critical really considers safety, again, back to that word safety, as an important element of sexual pleasure. And it also considers relational ethics in sexuality, things like mutual consideration. Is this something that both partners want, right? Is there any presence of coercion? And what is the quantity or quality of pleasure? Those things are always important. So it's important to bring that in to the fold as well. When talking about sexuality with clients, if it ever comes up, I always say, if you're a provider, you're working with clients, it's important to understand the basics about STIs, which are sexually transmitted infections. Understand the STI basics and safe sex practices. I'm not going to go into them real deeply here because, you can find them easily online, all info on all this stuff. But I would say just get a little bit educated, just a little. So if clients ever bring in that they're concerned that they have a sexually transmitted infection, or they're afraid of getting one, that you are able to have that conversation with them on a basic level. It really lends to your credibility and helps the client know, again, you're comfortable with talking about sexuality, which is really the important thing I want to drive home here. Is really, this is about developing a sense of just comfort and openness around talking about sexuality. I will say something about PrEP, because not everyone knows about PrEP, but I think it's really important to talk about with clients that are sexually active. PrEP is something called pre-exposure prophylaxis. It is an antiretroviral medication for HIV, and it prevents people from contracting HIV. So it makes it so if you have unprotected sex with someone with HIV, you cannot get the virus if you are on this medication. So the PrEP is now more effective than condom use. So I often say to clients, if you are sexually active, if they tell me they're sexually active, I will ask them if they're on PrEP or if they've considered it. When I do the registration with clients and I ask for their medications, if they're on PrEP, they will often let me know right away that they are. So that conversation can come up. And so it's important to know about, and then know about safe sex stuff like condom use, dental dams, lube, sex toy hygienics, Gardasil to prevent HPV. And so, that what used to be limited to teenage girls, then to teenagers. Now I think people up to 50 can get Gardasil. So, and HPV is what can cause genital, cervical, and anal cancers. So that can be important to talk about. And then those are the STIs to know about, right? The real basic ones that we often hear about. So just, get a little educated on those. All right, so I'm going to talk about gay male sexuality, then lesbian sexuality, then queer and transsexuality, just to give you a sense of what kind of looks like and feels like for people in these communities, so that when they bring this up to you, you know what they're talking about and you have some sense of how to talk about it. Again, you don't have to know these things real deeply. And the more you work with these clients, the more comfortable you get, the more you will get to know about sexuality. But it's important to know just some of the basics. Again, just so you can feel comfortable having these conversations with clients and know what they're talking about. So gay men are more sexual than women and heterosexual men. That has been shown in comparative studies. Gay men on the whole have more frequent sex, more casual sex, and greater number of partners. And we could have a whole conversation about why that is. And I would guess that part of it has to do with being male conditioning. And also there is a late stage adolescence that happens with the gay community that I get into in part 2. But when gay men come out, especially later in life, there is a tendency to want to kind of make up for lost time. They didn't have a chance to go through their psychosexual development at a younger age. So they can go into that at an early age. And sometimes it lasts for many, many years. And I've listed some of the sexual practices that gay men might talk about. Topping and bottoming, which is topping is being the insertive anal partner, bottoming is being the receptive anal partner. Some men identify as being versatile, which means they can go both ways. Some gay men identify as sides, which means that they prefer not to have anal sex or they're not comfortable with it. Also just grinding or rubbing bodies together, oral sex, different kinds of anal stimulation, and mutual masturbation. These are all ways that gay men have sex, and your clients may talk to you about. It is important for gay clients in general, especially those I would say in phase 5 of development in the later stage, that their therapists be comfortable with talking about sexuality. For some, not all, but for some, they can be involved in a sort of sex culture in the gay community that that involves like having a lot of sex parties, group sex, open relationships. There's something called circuit parties where there's a lot of music. There can be drug use. There can be sex that happens, and clients can talk about that. And again, there is that exploration of what do these things mean to you when you sit with a client. There can also be kind of sexual tribes, as they're called, sexual groups within the community. And I've listed a few there, leather, daddy, twink, discreet, jock. I don't have time to go into what each of those are, but if you're curious, again, you can always look it up online. So then there's lesbian sexuality. And before I get into lesbian sexuality and queer and trans sexuality, I will say that I am not a member of either of these groups. So I'm not acting as a representative or a proxy. I'm relaying information based on my own research and my experience with clients. So lesbian sexuality is female-centered despite social myths. So lesbians may use sex toys like dildos or vibrators as a part of their sexual experience, but that is a way that they're connecting with each other. That does not mean that they want an actual penis. It's not a substitute for a penis for them. And 70% of the focus with lesbian sexuality is on oral genital sex as a large component of the sexual stimulation. Many different ways of having sex, as I said before, it's not just, it's not intercourse, right? Ways lesbians have sex can include hugging, licking, snuggling, kissing all over the body, breast stimulation, digital masturbation. And there's more time spent on sexual behaviors that would be considered foreplay to most people. And I often like to say something about lesbian bed death because it can come up, especially with couples. For me, lesbian bed death is this idea that came about in the early 80s, in which sex essentially dies with the couple. Lesbians, this is a sort of stereotype that lesbians move in with each other very quickly. The romance is very intense in the beginning, and the sex usually stops happening after a couple of years after they move in together. Even though the love may last, they may still be very good partners, but nothing's happening in bed. So there has been this debate over time whether that's true or not. But I have had my lesbian clients talk to me about it, sometimes joke about it. For that, it's not always their experience, but sometimes they will say that that has been their experience. And whether it's true or not, some studies show that lesbians don't have any less sex than straight people. So some studies show that they do, and then there are other writings that actually assert the opinion of what does it matter if if the couple is happy. So that's really what it comes down to. But I will say, in my experience, working with gay male couples and lesbian couples, it's generally the case that lesbians are wanting to work on reigniting sexual passion, and gay men seem to be okay with their sex life, but need to work more on their emotional connection. So finally, queer and trans sexuality. Now, I include the word queer in this because, trans people have romantic and sexual relationships with cisgender people who may identify as queer, right? And those people who are in relationships with trans people also are dealing with transsexuality and working with it. So some things that's important to know about transsexuality that may come into your conversation with trans clients is one that trans clients and non-binary clients, I include trans and non-binary clients, often don't have the same experience of their body that cisgender people do. Like the dominant cultural narrative doesn't match their own experience of their body. So they often find it useful to rewrite the narrative of their body, to use different language, to use what's called degendering language to describe body parts. A very common one that I hear used with trans men is they may talk about their front hole and their back hole for sex. And clients may come up with their own individual names for certain sex characteristics that they carry. And their sexual pleasure in their body may not be the same. Sometimes being aroused in the genitals may trigger gender dysphoria. Sometimes that may be traumatic. So they may experience sexuality in different parts of their bodies, different erogenous zones. And so that also becomes a part of kind of rewriting their narrative and determining what that is for them. There is an effect that hormones have on sexuality. Estrogen and anti-androgens can lead to a decreased sex drive with trans women. And testosterone can lead to an increased sex drive for trans men. That is pretty common. And also, I'll jump down to the last bullet point here. Shifting sexual preferences or orientations can happen with hormones. So it's not unusual for trans women to maybe become curious about men when they weren't before, or for trans men to start to be attracted to women when they weren't before, or even for trans men to become attracted to men when they weren't before. That is very common. So if that ever happens with a trans client, that's something to just kind of say that's normal, that's common. And of course, if the client does have surgery, that of course can have impact on someone's sexual response. So the client, and that has a lot to do with figuring out what your erogenous zones are. Or if you're a partner of a trans person, what are your partner's erogenous zones? What turns them on? So we may be a part of this process for the clients, maybe not, but it's important to know that this is a part of their process when it comes to sexuality. All right, so I talked about sexuality. I'm going to shift and talk about gender. How do we hold gender with our clients? I already mentioned, that, when we're kind of in queerness as a therapist, we're holding things in a non-binary way. So the gender spectrum helps us to do that. And the gender spectrum, you might think of it as having kind of male or female on either side of the spectrum, and in between are variations of gender. And there are people, clients, who experience their gender somewhere in this area, along this spectrum, not as male or female in a binary way, but somewhere along this spectrum. So clients may come to you identifying in different ways along the spectrum. Some may identify as non-binary, meaning that they don't identify as male or female, as particularly masculine or feminine. They maybe see and experience themselves as in the middle of the spectrum. Other clients may identify as trans-masculine, which is also non-binary, right? But it's on the more masculine end of the spectrum. This is pretty common these days, by the way. People more often than not, in my practice, will identify as trans-masculine or as trans-feminine. Right? So these are just some terms to be aware of, and it's a framework to be aware of. It's a way of staying current in your practice with trans and non-binary clients, just to be aware of this. But I will also say that there are trans people, non-binary people, who feel like this gender spectrum is outdated. And so there's like new ways of kind of formulating how to conceptualize gender and how to express it in a way that feels true to the person. Okay, so I have a list here of outdated terminology and current terminology. So using gender affirmative language is important. And part of that is staying current on the terminology that's used. So everything on the left is pretty outdated. We don't generally use these anymore. And you may even notice that stuff on the left is pretty recent. It wasn't too long ago we were using some of these terms. Now, transsexual and transvestite are definitely outdated terms. We don't use those anymore, unless my one caveat is if the client wants to if that's what the client wants to call themselves. Remember, if we use the client's language and follow their lead. But in general, we use the terms over here, trans, transgender, non-binary, and NB. On the left here, we don't use any of these terms. It wasn't long ago we were saying things like biological male, natal male, and such. We don't do that anymore. Now we say assigned male at birth, or we simply use the acronym AMAB. So I say that I am assigned male at birth. I wouldn't say I'm a natal male. And especially with trans clients, you would use this term. So a client who is transitioning to be trans feminine, I would say that that client was assigned male at birth, or I might say that they are AMAB. Same with if it's a female transitioning to being transmasculine, I would say that person is assigned female at birth, or AFAB. Again, this is the current terminology, and some of you may have already heard this. I said earlier today that I am a cisgender man. That means that I am not trans. That means that my gender identity matches my assigned sex at birth. So we no longer say, a real man or woman. We don't make the distinction between I'm a man and this is a trans man. The distinction is made by me saying I'm a cis man and here's a trans man, right? Because we're getting rid of the notion of real, right? What's a real man? So you can also, for short, say cis man or cis woman. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to everyone. Cisgender means gender identity matches assigned sex at birth. And we no longer say the opposite sex or opposite gender. We say another sex or a different gender. And also, instead of both sexes, both genders, say all genders. We no longer say M to F or male to female or female to male in that binary terminology. We now just say transgender woman or transgender man, or for short, trans woman, trans man. Right? So this is the current terminology. And by the way, you can find this in a book that I will recommend to you. It's called A Clinician's Guide to Gender Affirming Care. That book will have a lot of the current terminology, and it also has a lot about the medical transition process, a lot of the procedures, if you want information on all of that. That's a great book to have. And I can put that in the chat later. Instead of preferred name, we say chosen name now. Instead of legal or real name, we say given or dead name. Dead name is very, that's a popular term with young people. Young people really like dead name, but you can use any of these. Instead of preferred pronouns or preferred gender pronouns. Again, not too long ago, we were using that. We just say, what are your pronouns? And with regard to surgery, all of these are outdated terms. Now these are the ones we use. We either say gender affirmation surgery or gender confirmation surgery. Either of those are appropriate. So just something to keep in mind when you're talking with your clients and with colleagues. I want to run down some other gender affirming terms that are often used these days that it can be helpful to include in your own vocabulary as a provider. So one of those is gender creative. So gender creative is a term that's usually used with children. And it's used with children when, children often haven't, claimed an identity yet, but they many times are in exploration. So they may want to, express themselves in ways that are not traditional, and don't want to necessarily be called male or female. So oftentimes these children are called gender creative children. We're not necessarily saying that they're trans because they're still exploring, but we're not saying that they're male or female because they don't want to be called male or female, but they're called gender creative. So it avoids assigning someone a gender while they're still exploring. Gender expansive is also another term that's used. And this may be used with folks who, you know, who really don't feel like they even fit on that gender spectrum I mentioned. Like I mentioned, like agender people, gender fluid people. There are people called pangender, omnigender. So people whose gender identity or expression is just broadly, more broad than the commonly held definitions might be called gender expansive. Gender journey is a very common term used these days. And when we work with trans people, we're often with them on their gender journey. And I found that it can be very helpful to talk about it in those terms, to say that you are on your gender journey right now, which is really, it's a process of discovery, and it's a process of moving forward towards the alignment of gender identity and gender expression and body and spirit and lived experience. So, you know, from the time a client or, you know, someone who's trans identifies that they're trans and then, you know, begins social transition and then, you know, starts disclosing to others that they're trans and then starts, you know, engaging in medical transition, legal transition, all of that is a part of their gender journey. So framing it as a journey can be helpful. And finally, gender euphoria is a really important term these days. So much focus is often put on gender dysphoria, you know, that feeling of malaise that clients feel. I'll talk more about that next week. But a lot of trans providers will agree with this. We don't talk enough about gender euphoria, which is the feeling of relief and satisfaction and joy that arises from gender affirmation and alignment. So as we're as we're with clients on their gender journey, those moments that lift them up and that make them feel affirmed and validated and in alignment with self, those moments are moments of gender euphoria. And what we want to do with our trans clients is help them build more moments like that, more moments of gender euphoria. You know, someone, you know, looks in the mirror and they start to look more how they feel on the inside. That's gender euphoria. They go out and someone genders them appropriately. That is gender euphoria, right? They start to take hormones and start to just feel better. Gender euphoria, all those moments. And so part of our job is to help the client decrease gender dysphoria, but also to increase moments of euphoria. So I'll say something about the use of pronouns. The most common pronouns are the feminine, the masculine, and the gender neutral. She, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. And I'm going to guess that most of you out there have already heard of these gender pronouns. So I would say get into the habit of just, you know, asking about pronouns, also saying what your pronouns are, of not assuming pronouns. There are other pronouns that clients may use, listed over on the right: sie, them, zers, sie, ers, am, ir. And you can look those up more online and see YouTube videos on them. They're not so common, I find, anymore. Some clients do use them, but they're not so common. Most clients will use one of the ones on the left. So it's just to say that there are other pronouns that clients use. And again, you can always ask them, what do those pronouns mean for you when you talk with them? So the reason I want to emphasize pronouns is because it is so important with trans and non-binary clients. Pronouns for a trans person is a recognition and a validation of who a person is. And it really is so much so, like, in ways that we don't even recognize. I often suggest people imagine being called the wrong pronoun on a regular basis and just see how that feels. That's often how a trans or non-binary person feels on a regular basis when someone calls them by the wrong pronoun. So be aware of, this is a practice for us as providers, like, be aware of and don't assume anyone's pronouns. I'm inviting you to step out of the usual discourse of assuming pronouns based on presentation. And this is a big shift for folks. And then get into the habit of asking for other people's pronouns, especially in your intake, especially with trans and non-binary clients. And then include your own pronouns on your website, everything, business cards, marketing materials, email signature. I have that, have my pronouns in my email signature, and some of you may already do that as well. So it communicates an awareness that you feel pronouns are important. This creates safety for the clients. When clients come into your office and they hear you asking about pronouns, they see you asking about pronouns in your paperwork, they know this is a safe space. Failing to use the correct pronouns to refer to someone is called misgendering. So you'll hear clients being misgendered. That means someone called them by the wrong pronoun, and that's considered a microaggression to them. So that happens all the time outside of our workplace and our offices. So we want to make sure that we are not creating the same microaggression in our office, because our office needs to be a safe place for them. That said, we may make a mistake. Sometimes we're human. We may misgender our trans and non-binary clients. This can especially happen when clients change their pronouns when we're with them, right, in relationship. And so we may use the wrong pronoun. If that happens, just correct yourself and move on. So avoid any of the shame and lengthy apologies, because that makes it about you. And so you want to just make it about the client as soon as possible. So just a simple acknowledgement, oh, I'm sorry about that, and move on. That's the way to handle it. It's also important for us to, if we're going to work with trans and non-binary clients, to know medical transition basics. Again, you don't have to do a deep dive into this and know everything, but just be able to talk about these things on a basic level. And then as you get to work with trans and non-binary clients, you'll get to know these procedures more deeply. And again, I'll refer you to that book, Clinician's Guide to Gender Affirming Care. That goes very much into detail into a lot of different medical interventions. But we must know about hormone replacement therapy, also called HRT, which is usually the first thing trans clients do when they start medical intervention. So it will either be feminizing hormones, which are estrogen and anti-androgens for trans feminine people or trans women, or masculinizing hormones, which would be testosterone, or sometimes that's called T, for trans men or trans masculine people. So estrogen and anti-androgens are most often given orally through pills. Testosterone is often with injection or a patch, but estrogen can also be given by injection. It just depends on what's worked out between the client and their endocrinologist. And most insurances nowadays will cover HRT. Hair removal is another thing that's often needed for trans feminine people. That's done with either electrolysis or laser. There is a push to try to get insurance to cover this as a medical necessity, but that's not there yet. Clients will have to pay out of pocket for this. And then there's gender affirming top surgery, the chest reconstruction, which will be either removal of breasts for trans men, or it will be breast enhancement for trans women. But it's a very common surgery for trans men. And again, insurance will often cover this. And it requires about roughly a 3 to 4 week recovery period. For trans masculine people, there's a hysterectomy and oophorectomy, which is the removal of the uterus and ovaries. Then there's gender affirming lower surgery. Used to be called bottom surgery, but I'm hearing it called lower surgery more and more. That's for trans feminine people, that would be vaginoplasty. For trans men, it would be phalloplasty. And there are different types of these surgeries, by the way. There's different types of top surgeries. There's different types of vaginoplasties and phalloplasties. It can be done in many different ways. And so there is always a surgical consult that the client does with the doctor. And again, this is something you would get educated about as you moved along in the process. So lower surgeries are not nearly as common as top surgeries. Top surgeries are very common. They're easy. they're relatively easy in terms of insurance pays for them, and the recovery time is not too bad. But lower surgery is, it's a higher cost in terms of, having to pay more out of pocket, and also taking the time off work to recover, also having to go back for multiple surgeries. So a lot of times people have to really consider if they want to go through all that and make a decision about it. That may be something trans folks do with you. Then there's facial feminization surgery, also called FFS. There is another big push to try to get this met as a medical necessity. This would obviously be for trans feminine people. Facial surgery is not really so much an issue for trans masculine people, because the masculinizing hormones do help to shape the face, but feminizing hormones don't. Once testosterone has kicked in earlier in life, that's the face is already shaped. There's the Adam's apple. So those things need to be taken care of with surgery. And then vocal training as well. Again, this would be for trans feminine people, because the testosterone helps change the voice. But so trans women may need help with vocal training. And then there's cryogenic storage for people who want to have kids. So that may come up. So just know these terms, know a little bit about them. Clients will not necessarily expect you to know about them really well or real deeply. So just know enough to engage when necessary. That all said, don't fixate on medical transition. I really want to drive that home too. It's important to not assume that all trans clients want to medically transition. They don't. They may not even have access to transition-related healthcare, so may not be relevant to them. And not all trans clients relate to the concept of transition. It may not even have anything to do with their own story. So what we want to do as clinicians is listen for the client's interest and concern about medical transition. If they don't bring it up, then it's likely not relevant to your work with them. So that's key. There's a lot of unfortunate stories in which therapists start asking trans clients about their bodies, about surgery, whether they've had it, whether they want it, and that was never invited by the client. So really, we want to be prepared to talk about it, but don't bring it up if the client doesn't bring it up. That they'll say that it's something they want to address. The terms post-op and pre-op are pretty outdated terms as well. It is a binary term, and it also perpetuates the idea that all trans people want surgery. And I won't spend a lot of time on this chart, but this is talking about degendering the body, or discussing the body in a way that degenders the terminology. And we do this because these primary sex characteristics, the words that we've come to use have become so gendered, right? So for example, the term breasts has become so associated with being a woman that for a transmasculine person, they may not like that term at all. So you might choose to use the term chest, which is a more neutral term. It's something to be aware of and check out with the client, and use gender neutral terms when possible. And if you're not sure, ask the client what they would like to use. How would they like to refer to parts of their body if you have to talk about them in session, okay? And here's some other examples that you can look at here in this chart. And again, this is in the book, A Clinician's Guide to Gender Affirming Care. So overall, in discussing trans clients' bodies, here are some things to keep in mind. If discussing bodies or body parts is relevant to the client's concern, make every effort to use gender neutral language. So that's kind of one principle to keep in mind. Never ask a trans person about their genitals unless you have a legitimate reason to do so. Again, lots of unfortunate stories about trans people who have been asked invasive questions about their genitals and surgery when it wasn't even an issue of concern for them. It was just a curiosity about on the therapist's part. Don't ask about genitals or body parts unless it really is a part of the conversation. It can be more respectful to refer to body parts as the instead of your. for example, the cervix. And also just be mindful that discussing body parts can be emotionally upsetting or can cause a trauma response in some clients. So when in doubt, just ask what language is affirming or at least distressing for the clients. All right, so I talked about sexuality, I talked about gender, kind of just how to hold those in spirit and in language with the clients, as just kind of as a part of building a safe environment for your clients. So now I'll talk about some other ways to build safety in the room. And one of those ways is to be aware of minority stress and microaggressions. That's really important. I'm going to talk a lot more about the impact of minority stress on LGBTQ people next week, but it's important that we be aware that our queer clients are dealing with minority stress on a regular basis when they come to us. And so it's important for us to be mindful of this and to avoid neutrality. A big mistake that therapists make in working with clients is to go into that neutral zone when clients talk about these experiences, and then the client doesn't feel affirmed by the therapist and what they're saying. So clients really need for us, I'm talking about our LGBTQ clients, really need for us to be allies and to side with them in their grievance, right? In their distress about these microaggressions that happen on a regular basis. I have a list of things there that might come up, right? Things that they might bring to session with us. And one of those I hear a lot with trans people is constantly being misgendered and how painful that is for them. It's really important to be met with empathy. And of course, the empathy needs to be genuine, right? So it's important for us to do the work of connecting with how painful that is for the clients. Dealing with gendered bathrooms, very, very stressful for trans and non-binary clients. Gendered institutional forms, which may be the case if you work for a clinic. There may be gendered institutional forms that don't account for other gender identities. The assumption of heterosexuality, not being able to be publicly affectionate, not being able to be fully yourself in public, hearing slurs, all of these things can be brought up. And so it's important for us, again, to be allies. An important thing, I'll go to the bottom bullet point here. Trans people need to go through this gatekeeping process for surgery even still, right? They need a letter from us. They need a letter from therapists. So that is, for them, that's a minority stressor. And we're a part of that, right? So the therapist is a kind of a part of that gatekeeping process. And it can be helpful to acknowledge that, to say, hey, you're going through this gatekeeping, it's stressful, and I'm a part of that as well. Okay, so there's just an acknowledgement of the system, right? And how we have to kind of play this. So it's also helpful to talk about minority stressors and microaggressions, like kind of in this systemic way, to be aware of common discourses that affect LGBTQ clients. And we'll talk more next week about how to address these in a strategic way in therapy. But, we can, in terms of creating a safe environment, we can name these with the clients, right? We can name things like heteronormativity, right? That the client is immersed in heteronormativity or in homophobia in their daily lives, and it can be helped to name that and to use these terms with clients. Again, these are dominant discourses that the clients live with and feel kind of immersed in. I'll just clarify what some of these terms mean if you don't know. Like allonormativity is the normalization of sexual desire. So asexual people may feel a sense of allonormativity. Gender essentialism is the idea that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and that's fixed, right? Bi erasure, the erasure of bi people. Okay, so yeah, so talking about it in these terms can also help create a safe environment and help the client understand, oh, my therapist is clued into this. It's also important for us to understand current events and resources. when we're working with this population. So it's stay current on what is happening. This is what I want to tell you. Stay current on what's happening in the area of LGBTQ rights, legislation, and resources, especially as it affects your area, the area you live in and practice in. And be prepared for how your client might be affected by any updates. I will say that the anti-trans legislation that has been happening across the country, even, where I work in the Bay Area, the trans people are being affected by it. They all have mentioned it to me. So, I have to be prepared to know what's going on because they know about it. And if I know about it, they know I care. So I just kind of stay up on this stuff. And that is also part of creating safety. So keep up on the national legislation, local laws, any recent incidents of LGBT hate crimes or suicides. I want to emphasize the last bullet point here, which is knowing your local resources and that are LGBTQ competent. And this is going to vary based on where you live. You might live in an area that has a lot more resources, and then you may live in an area that has very little. But if you may need to refer your client to an outpatient treatment program, or to a hospitalization program. You may need to refer them to legal assistance or support service. Wherever you refer your queer client, they're going to be dealing with the culture that they go into. So it's very important that we know what are the supportive resources. So before you send your client to an outpatient treatment program, check in to see, does that outpatient treatment program have an LGBTQ policy? Especially for trans people, what's their policy on trans and non-binary clients, right? Because you don't want to send your client into kind of a hostile zone. And that's with any referrals, but I think especially with mental health treatment referrals. And if you live in an area where there are little resources, I would say, sometimes you might become the person who educates, right? Who reaches out to these other programs and lets them know, what the blind spots are. I had a recent example from a consultee who had a trans client go to a dialysis clinic, and the dialysis clinic had very gendered forms, and that was very upsetting for the client. The therapist got in touch with the dialysis center, wrote them by email, and expressed her concern that her trans client was uncomfortable there, and got a really positive response. And as a result, that dialysis clinic changed their policy for trans people. So that's where we can get politically involved and be an advocate for our clients. And in turn, we're establishing safety. The client knows that they can trust us, they can count on us. So office setup and introduction. What our client walks into and sees, the cues that they have, let us know that this is a safe environment. Like when we come out and do something as basic as greeting the clients, having degendered language, especially trans clients, if we're using things like ma'am and sir and mister, that automatically can be a signal for them that, we're thinking, we have binary thinking. So just kind of be aware of that. The imagery in your office can make a big difference. If you have LGBTQ literature in the waiting room, or even just like a little pride flag somewhere, it can be small. If the client sees this, they say that's an ally, right? This is a safe zone. Also, having gender neutral bathrooms is really important for trans and non-binary clients. So registration and intake forms, are also important. In my practice, I just leave the section for sexual orientation and gender blank, so that allows the client to write in whatever they want. But if you work in a clinical setting where there are, demographics have to be recorded, you may have to have categories. So I have there listed the categories that are the most current, the most common, and that I would suggest tracking. So those are the ones for sexual orientation and ones for gender. And having this in your registration form, again, will let the client know that this is an inclusive, safe place. It's a signal. All right. So at this point, I'm going to do a review of what I've talked about. I'm going to talk about the do's and the don'ts. I'm going to start with the don'ts, and then we'll make time for questions. So we'll start with the don'ts. These are the common therapist mistakes that break trust, okay? Again, this is just a review and just to kind of summarize what not to do if you want to build a safe environment. So one mistake is being neutral about microaggressions and systemic injustice. So I already mentioned that. So kind of just, taking a neutral or blank slate tone will kind of can break any kind of trust that might be building. So, be an ally and side with the client. Another common mistake that therapists or providers can make is using heteronormative language in the intake paperwork and interview. So I just talked about that. Next, using outdated terminology. And so that's why I showed you the chart with the outdated terms and then the current terminology. And terminology will continue to evolve. It will continue to change. I often have to update the list, every few months or so. And if you'd like, I can also let you know about some sites where you can kind of keep up with the terminology. Failing to use proper pronouns or misgendering, which I just talked about a bit ago as well. Not understanding basic ideas about sex and gender. So that's why I went over how to hold sex and how to hold gender, so that, just being able to talk about the basics with a client will be helpful for them. Another mistake, having a quote, all relationships are the same approach. So if you come into this, feeling like, gay people are just like straight people, and kind of using that as your template, that can be a mistake. Queer clients want to know that you are open to, the experience that they're bringing into the room. What is their sexuality like, right? And what is their relationship as a queer couple? They want to know that we're curious about that and that we're not just using a heteronormative template. Next, being overly apologetic or defensive after making a mistake with terminology and pronouns. So that can be very awkward for a client. We make a mistake, we use an outdated term, or we use the wrong pronoun. Maybe we call the person by the wrong name, and then we become overly defensive or overly apologetic. And then it becomes about us. So that's a big mistake. Just, again, just correct yourself, gently acknowledge the mistake and move on to the next thing. And next, being evasive about sex and gender when the client wants to talk about it. So if the client, that's why, again, I went over sexuality and gender. Because when the client brings up their sex life, that, you feel like you can be in the room with it and talk about it. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to be an expert, but just to be able to be in the room and talk with them about it and be curious. Asking invasive questions about the client's sex life, body, or gender transition that are not clinically relevant. So this is kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum, right? Where the therapist might be asking questions that maybe it is about sexuality, maybe it is about the body or gender, but it has nothing to do with what the client is bringing in. So make sure that your questions are in line with the client's presenting issues and goals. Being unaware of one's own homophobia, transphobia, or heterosexism, and or denying it. So that's one thing we have to practice, right? Is being aware of what are our blind spots, so that when clients bring them up to us, we can talk about it with the clients. It's important for us to own our blind spots, and that it will also build trust, right? Because it's not about not ever making mistakes, but it's about, can you talk about that with the client and have an open conversation with them, right? And own your own conditioning. Next, not being up to date on current events that affect LGBTQ people. So I just talked about the importance of that, right? What are these current stressors that are affecting our clients? Pushing clients to take coming out or transition steps they are not ready for. That is another big mistake. I'm going to really get into that next week's section, because part of our part of our work with clients is tuning in to where they are at in their development as a queer person. Sometimes we want them to be farther along than they're ready for. Sometimes when a client is just starting to acknowledge that they're gay, but they're not ready to come out to their family or friends yet. And we as a clinician are like, "What? Your family and friends would be fine with this. Come on out." And then we start to push them. We start to really encourage them to do so. That's not what we want to do. So pushing, we have to meet the client in their place of readiness and then be ready to take the next step with them as they're ready to. Again, more on that next week. And finally, another mistake, appraising or making comments on a client's body or dress. So don't do that in general, especially with trans and non-binary clients. It's very sensitive. So, if a client comes in and maybe they pass more in the way they're dressing this week, or you even think they look really good, if you say anything about it, you just don't know what you're opening when you do that. Okay, the client may appreciate it, but then what happens if you don't say it next week? What happens if they come in next week and then you don't make a positive comment? So it's best to just kind of avoid that. So here are the do's. These are the affirming practices. Use the client's language to define themselves in their practice. So just follow their lead. Whatever their language is, whatever they're calling themselves, whatever they're calling their practices, just use the same language. Know the most up-to-date terminology. Have that LGBTQ literature and imagery in your waiting area and office. Just a little signal or something to let them know this is a safe space. Include queer and trans inclusive language in your paperwork and intake forms. Know your local LGBTQ resources and be prepared to offer those to clients. Be an active ally in helping and validate clients. And this last one is helpful, but it's also optional, I say. Disclose your sexual orientation and/or gender identity when asked, and be prepared to discuss what that means for the clients. Now, some of you out there may have a psychodynamic orientation, right? So a kind of way of working that says that you share in a limited way about your own life, and that is okay. You don't necessarily have to share your sexual orientation or gender identity with the client. And I would even say if you're doing everything else on this list and avoiding the other mistakes, then you've already proven your credibility and you don't have to share that. But I will say that it can be very helpful to disclose with the client. And for some LGBTQ clients, it is very important that they know the sexual orientation of their therapist, right? Or the gender identity of their therapist. And they may even go so far as to say, if my therapist doesn't tell me, I won't see them. And that's okay. And you might be the kind of therapist that chooses not to disclose. But it can be very helpful to disclose. Just be clear that when you disclose, that you're doing it for the benefit of the relationship and of serving the client, not for you. But it can be helpful. So that said, that is the end of part 1 of our training. And at this point, I would like we have about maybe 13 minutes left. So I'd like to open it up for questions if anyone has any. And maybe there's some in the chat. So let me see if anyone put anything in here. Thank you so much for your feedback on the training. I appreciate that. I'm so glad that this was helpful. Someone wrote, there are multiple websites you can find online that allow you to practice using different pronouns for anyone that feels they could use practice with that. Yes, I agree, Natalie. Thank you for that. It's really easy to find stuff online these days if you want to update yourself. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your kind comments. Thank you. All right. So no questions in the chat. Sometimes it's good that there's no questions. Maybe all your questions got answered. So I just want to make room if anyone is raising their hand at this point to make time for that. And if not, we can go ahead and close.
And I know a few people are asking about the slides or maybe an more information they can get later.
Yeah, you know what? I can't share the slides, but what I can do is create a handout with key information. So how about I do that for next week and give you a handout to share? Yeah.
I just ask anyone wanting that handout, please drop your emails in the chat so that I can distribute that later on. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to next week.
Yes, thank you.
That's where we'll get into the real meaty stuff.
This is awesome. This is awesome. Thank you so much. I'll be staying on while everyone's putting their emails in the chat. Thank you again, Aaron. I'll be talking to you next week. And thank you, everyone. Enjoy your extended weekend and be safe.
Thank you, Shanice. Thank you, everyone. Happy weekend.
Happy weekend.